The crowd buzzed in front of the exam results board. 20-year-old Yuto Fujisaki has not found his name there for the second year in a row. He walked to the local mini-market. He froze in front of the automatic doors. Yuto helplessly grabbed his head due to yet another defeat. He blamed himself for not trying hard enough again. With a downcast expression, the boy went inside. His thoughts were interrupted by a scream. A man in a mask was waving a knife. The boy went pale, realizing that it was a robbery, while the bandit was already urging the cashier. Yuto quietly lowered himself to the floor. The frightened cashier was crying, unable to move. The robber aggressively pointed a blade at her. At that moment, Yuto jumped out from behind and struck the attacker with a broom. The criminal fiercely turned with a knife, while the boy gripped the shard of the handle more tightly. A man in a medical mask screamed wildly, shaking his whole body. A boiling broth unexpectedly flew into the air. The saleswoman barely managed to flinch so that the hot mixture didn't hit her right in the face. At that moment, a young man in glasses appeared from behind and struck the attacker on the head with force. The hero exhaled breathlessly. An inadequate person fell to the floor of the supermarket and a knife slipped from his hands. The rescued girl smiled with relief and sincerely thanked. And then a deafening roar was heard. The silhouette of the young man blurred, and the light before his eyes quickly faded. The pupils dilated in shock. The young man came to his senses under the endless cloudy sky and bewilderedly mumbled whether he had ended up in paradise. Hearing movement nearby, he quickly turned around. Together with the unknown old man, the young man stood on a giant white plane in the middle of the sky, fully realizing his own death. The gray-haired old man suddenly leaned forward and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I am very sorry." The old man in white attire met the boy and immediately apologized. The young man stood perplexed in front of the old man. He grabbed his head, trying in vain to comprehend the situation. The old man grimly confessed that he had accidentally cast a deadly curse on himself and two other people. The ground slipped from under my feet. The stranger calmly turned away and explained that they were currently suspended in a liminal dimension, a step away from paradise. It turned out he was going to unleash punishment on his own world. But he missed, and the blow fell on Earth, for he is God himself. The boy panicked and ran after him, demanding to know what would happen to him now. The creator lowered his eyes in guilt. With a warm smile, he promised to use his strength for the rebirth of the young man. But he set a condition. The new life would only take place in his personal world. Bringing the boy home was not working out. Even divine powers had their limits. When asked where it would take him, the old man joyfully spread his arms. Ahead lay a classic fantasy world of swords and magic. Dark visions of dangerous lands filled with magical creatures arose in my mind. From the thick darkness, their stone faces grinned ominously. The shadows of the monsters merged into an endless predatory horde. The vision dissipated. The young man in the bright room cautiously asked for permission to ask a few questions, and the interlocutor nodded briefly. The old man in white turned with a smile and promised to bestow the boy with a special skill to compensate for his inability to help in any other way. Upon learning that in the new world he would start life as an ordinary baby, Yuto immediately asked about magic. The young man was quite surprised when he learned about the limitations of the elements and began to inquire about their total number. The old man stroked his mustache and gently assured the boy that he would still be able to cast spells. After this, God commanded him to say the command, "Open status." Yuto listened attentively to the instructions. God raised a finger and enumerated the foundations of the world: fire, water, wind, earth, and sacred magic. The boy followed the instruction, and a screen with specifications instantly unfolded before him. The elder was openly astonished by the innate S-rank lightning magic. He hadn't even had the chance to bestow any gifts upon the young man yet. God explained that this interface will allow for convenient study of one's own abilities. God asked the final question: which gift the boy wants to receive. Suddenly his face became serious. The time for conversation was rapidly running out. He reached out his hand. Yuto pressed his palm firmly against his chest and resolutely exclaimed his desire to receive a talent where the reward would directly correspond to the effort put in. God stared at him in bewilderment. The elder thoughtfully murmured whether this desire had turned out to be too simple. The boy, in despair, blurted out that his characteristics might not increase at all with the new level, to which the old man calmly suggested innate talent. This gift worked like a cheat code, tripling the experience gained. If the indicators usually grew only slightly and depended on luck, this talent guaranteed to raise all characteristics simultaneously. "Please, give me this ability," the boy shouted frantically, realizing that he would level up much faster than others. In addition, the elder endowed him with clairvoyance, the ability to scan others' powers, read the flows of magic, and see freely in the dark. The joy vanished in an instant, and the boy anxiously asked what awaited the demigod now. The figure of the old man began to ascend into the sky. He had given all his strength for this rebirth, so his own existence was coming to an end. He added that he left doubles in his place. They are twice as weak, but they will definitely be able to take care of the other two companions. He added that he wouldn't have time to explain more, so each one would only receive a crumb of power. The boy stood still under the sparkling snow, listening to the final instructions. As a farewell, the ghostly old man gently placed his hands on his shoulders and finally dissolved into the light. The world was interrupted by the cry of a newborn. From now on, he was called Mars Bryant. The glow faded, and before my eyes emerged the quiet facade of an unfamiliar house at dawn. Finding himself in the body of a baby, he triggered a system window. He was now called Mars Bryant, and despite his unique traits, he retained cheat magic and innate clairvoyance. Little Mars was already lively running around the estate, leaving the babies who had just learned to crawl far behind. All of last year, he secretly trained his clairvoyance. Scanning each bush, bowl, or candle, the boy was rolling out his supply of mana from scratch. He arrived last at the table for the family dinner. His brother Ike was devouring bread with both cheeks, possessing solid skills in spear handling and fire magic for his age. Mother Maria was pleased with her son's friendship, and her hidden status revealed a high level of water magic. Father Zik praised Mars's obedience with satisfaction, having a considerable reserve of strength and decent earth magic behind him. The boy smiled contentedly as his cheeks were white, for a system window hung before his eyes. His mana had grown again. He eagerly peeked out from under the blanket, rejoicing at the next surge of magical power. Having drained the reserve to the bottom, the little one fainted helplessly. Later he woke up and thoughtfully stretched his hand upwards. Looking at the wooden ceiling, he decided it was time to test the magic in practice. The boy suddenly thrust his palm forward with the command to summon thunder, waited a second, but nothing happened in the room. He awkwardly crossed his bare legs. A nervous smile appeared on the face. Miracles are still impossible. In the evening, the whole family calmly gathered for dinner. Suddenly, the little one broke the silence. His direct question about how to use magic caught his parents off guard. His mother flinched, and his father froze. The boy just chuckled carelessly. The woman wiped a drop of sweat, smiled nervously, and cautiously asked the reason for such curiosity. Clenching his fists, the little boy declared that he wanted to learn right now, and this enthusiasm made his mother mentally promise him joint lessons with his older brother. Mother smiled in surprise and asked why her son needed healing magic. The eyes of Mars sparkled with hope. He declared that he dreams of healing their wounds with his father, and the adults were simply stunned by these words. The woman leaned towards the man and whispered that it was first worth checking the child's aptitude for holy magic. The family immediately gathered around the table for a skills test. Night has fallen. At dinner, the parents sent the children to bed early, postponing an important conversation until the morning. The father grimly crossed his arms over his chest. The next day in the yard, he stood before his sons and ordered Mars to make a promise. The couple announced their decision. They would teach both boys magic. The man warned that holy magic is a very rare and valuable gift. Mars nodded joyfully and carefree. At that moment, the father gripped his son's shoulders with a dead grip. Hovering over the child, he harshly commanded to keep this power in absolute secrecy. Mars and Ike sat on the grass, receiving instructions to search for the magical core just below the navel. Zik promised to check their elements right after mastering the basics. The boys closed their eyes, trying to disperse the energy through their veins. Sweat appeared on Mars's forehead. He could clearly feel the pulsing mass in his abdomen, but it proved difficult to make that force flow through his body. The adults nearby noticed a significant surge in his aura and held their breath. The bodies of both students simultaneously burst into a dense glow. The teacher laid out the magic sphere for status checking and suggested starting with Ike. However, it was Mars's results that left the adults stunned. His mana reached nearly 900 units, surpassing the mentor's fivefold, and among his skills shone the magic of wind and light. Ike's status also exceeded expectations. The guy turned out to be a natural warrior with a talent for the sword, spear, and fire. The next day, the teacher brought 2 grimoires, spending as much as 2 gold coins on them. The training was divided. Maria took on the task of deciphering the wind spell with Mars, while Zik took Ike under his wing. Feeling the magic, Mars suddenly thrust his palm forward. The gaze focused. A brief word escaped the lips. Wind. Mars closed his eyes and stretched out his hand, concentrating magic at the tips of his fingers. Behind him, the audience froze. Adults watched intently, while another boy impatiently clenched his fist. A powerful whirlwind burst forward with a roar. The wind, Mars exhaled calmly. Relatives rushed to hug the little one, praising him one after another. In a few days, Ike mastered fire magic as well. He was greeted with the same embraces. The adults were impressed by such talent, and the boy next to him firmly decided to train even harder to keep up. A year has passed. Two brothers lined up in the yard in front of the mansion. Their bodies were covered by a dense magical aura. The elder exhaled intently. The younger one mirrored his movement. With a smile on his face, the elder suddenly lunged forward, slicing through the air with a wooden sword and bursts of fire. The younger one didn't even flinch. He easily repelled the attack with a powerful gust of wind from his palms. The sparring immediately stopped as soon as the parents appeared on the stone path. The mother waved her hand joyfully and called her sons. The father smiled mysteriously, promising to show them something very interesting. The guys immediately agreed. At the table, the man solemnly revealed his surprise. The sword of the spirit of fire. The whole family gathered around the table in the living room. At the sight of the shining blade, Salamander's younger brother enchantingly gaped, as the weapon amplified magic from the very touch, and the elder simply shone with happiness. He tightly gripped the handle and sincerely thanked his father for the weapon that was perfect for his element. The man in the black glove extended the hilt of the sword to his senior student. Soon, a massive grimoire of sacred magic for beginners appeared in the world. The teacher handed over the book with a strict order to study it thoroughly. He gently smiled and again plunged his hand into the bag, announcing Mars's turn. That same night in the dark house, someone desperately but vainly tried to apply healing. Instead, during the day, Mars was glowing with happiness, tightly holding the received grimoire to his chest and loudly expressing his gratitude. Stepping into the yard, the boy focusedly extended his hand, determined to conquer the magic. Behind them, Brother Ake was practicing strikes with a wooden sword while Mars lamented his failures from yesterday. The boy took a deep breath and tightly closed his eyes. A flash. Pure light burst from his palm. The spell finally worked. Inspired by success, Mars turned around and asked why Ike was not training with his new sword Salamander. He just smiled warmly. His father instructed him to first hone the basics on a regular wooden one. Mars couldn't hold back and joyfully announced the news of his first successful spell. Ake blinked in surprise, but in just a moment both brothers froze in shock, staring at something in front of them. The training was interrupted by a familiar, weak voice that barely uttered the boys' names. Turning around, Ake and Mars rushed to their parents in horror. They could barely stand on their feet from the wounds. The father leaned heavily on his cane, using his last strength to support his battered mother. The woman weakly apologized for the trouble, while the man, through pain, asked for a towel. The monster in the dungeon had torn him up badly. The mother looked anxiously at her husband, whose injuries were significantly more serious. "Wait," suddenly said little Mars decisively. He reached out his palm to his father and shouted a healing spell, leaving his relatives stunned. The man's eyes widened in shock. A bright magical flash illuminated the yard. Wiping the sweat from his forehead with satisfaction, the boy calmly moved his hand to his mother. Mars smiled happily and asked if there were no more rants while the parents listened in shock to their feelings. The couple froze. Their bodies had completely healed. The father barely held back tears, assuring his son in a trembling voice that everything was fine now thanks to him. The mother rushed to hug her son, thanking him for already learning to heal. The mother joyfully scooped the little one into her arms while the older brother laughed happily. The father silently watched the scene with a tense gaze. In the evening, they gathered around the table by the fireplace, and he seriously announced the beginning of a family council regarding the boy's future. The man began with a reminder of the dangerous everyday life of adventurers and the constant hunt for monsters. The brothers fell silent, listening to the story of their parents' forced descent to the lower levels of the dungeon. He tightly grasped the hot mug and confessed. Today's manifestation of the sacred power of Mars made him reveal his cards. Just a few days ago, the ruler of these lands, Count Carmel, gave him a direct order to eliminate the dangerous monster in the catacombs. The father had a serious conversation with his sons about their future and helping with the family business. Ike and Mars listened carefully when he directly asked if they were ready to work, but he immediately raised a finger. He would make the final decision only after a year when the boys grow up. By the fireplace, a promise was made. The father would do everything possible to raise them into strong fighters during this time. And then, gently looking at his wife, he delivered the news. Soon there would be another child in the family. The brothers were simply stunned with their mouths open from such a surprise. Immediately after this, the guys got to work and began to train fiercely with wooden swords. A whole year has passed. Ake and Mars clashed again in a sparring match, but now dust was rising from their movements and leads were flying. The blows were falling like hail. The elder pressed with brute force, while the younger skillfully maneuvered and dodged. Ake put all his strength into a fierce side swing. Mars swiftly dove down, dodging the weapon overhead. They crossed their swords in midair with a leap, smiling excitedly at each other. Time had not passed in vain before the brothers' eyes. System windows unfolded with impressively enhanced combat characteristics. The heavy door creaked open. Ike skillfully swung his sword, enveloped in magical flames, gathering the captivated gazes of his family. However, the most important event was the birth of Lena's little sister, who already had her own magical characteristics in the cradle. The whole family gazed lovingly at the baby. A whole year flew by unnoticed, and during a family dinner, the father noted the remarkable progress of his sons. He decided not to delay and announced that tomorrow he would take Ike outside the city for a monster cleanup. Moreover, he insisted that little Mars go with them and shield them with holy healing magic. The mother immediately tensed up. Ike firmly supported his father, stating that he was ready to test his training in battle, but needed his brother by his side. The woman slammed her hands on the table. Mars is only 3 years old. The elder son calmly replied that the healing power of the small one could become their only salvation from wounds. Mars listened to this argument with an entirely adult determination. The mother helplessly lowered her gaze to the cup, torn between the desire to protect the boys and the necessity to stay home with Lena. The father broke the silence and addressed Mars directly. The final decision was up to him. The boy confidently stood before his father and declared that he would go with him and Ike. The mother sighed resignedly. She looked at the little one with understanding, unable to refuse him. However, she immediately raised her finger sternly. The children will not be given real equipment, so they will have to be prepared for anything. Ike calmly reminded to stay closer and avoid dangerous magical zones. The boy's face lit up with happiness. They were finally allowed to go. The woman cast a serious look at the man, fully trusting him with the safety of the children. She started to remind about the healing herbs, in case of magic failure, but didn't have time to finish. Father leaned forward sharply with a self-assured smile and exclaimed that he would take it all upon himself. A sharp slap of the palm on the table, the satisfied man cheerfully commanded to set off. Taking the staff, he led the boys down the path while his wife waved goodbye to them. She anxiously clenched her hands, whispering for them not to get into trouble. Soon the trio stood still in front of the massive building of the local guild. The white-haired boy crouched by the wall and carefully watched the couple who were laughing carefree nearby, catching himself thinking he was seeing other children here for the first time. His pupils sharply constricted, flashing a bizarre geometric pattern. In the air above the teenagers, system windows appeared with modest indicators, making the boy ponder in astonishment. Could it be that he and his partner surpass others so greatly in strength? Forward echoed over the city rooftops. The mage with the staff apologized to his 2 small companions for the delay, as he had just taken a quest to kill monsters. The trinity moved through the cobbled streets. Near the massive gate with guards, the young man smiled and nodded towards the exit. The wind rustled in the treetops. The boys ran out of the city walls with joyful panting. They raced forward with all their might, leaving the mage a little behind. Suddenly, the younger one stopped and opened his eyes wide in amazement. Before them lay an endless valley, surrounded by mountain ranges. The winding path disappeared among the green hills. The wind gently swayed the tall grass. Suddenly, the little one blinked. A strange, grinding sound was heard from the side. The wizard grabbed the staff and noted with satisfaction that they had reached their destination surprisingly quickly. 3 goblins were simply sitting in a forest clearing, now bewilderedly staring at the uninvited guests. The calm landscape was shattered by a vile shriek. 3 goblins with frankly pathetic characteristics jumped onto the road. The monsters immediately launched an attack, dividing the spoils among themselves on the go. The father didn't even flinch. He calmly ordered Isekai'D to prepare the sword and fire magic. "Watch and learn," said the wizard, lifting heavy stone blocks into the air. The whistling shells swept away the small monsters. Ike focused and suddenly thrust his hand forward. A pillar of flame struck from his palm, instantly engulfing the surviving goblin. The burning enemy fell heavily on his back. The father praised his son and ordered him to burn the corpses to ashes so that they would not rise as the undead. He squeezed a small crystal in his hand. Such things are torn from hands in the guild. The man reminded the boys to always collect the magical stones from the ashes of the slain monsters. The younger blonde son shone and asked to be allowed to try his magic next time. The father easily agreed, and the trio left the ruins behind. Mars smiled widely and stated that he uses a wind blade, not regular wind. The mentor sighed indulgently. Simple wind magic cannot defeat the monsters. The boy casually explained that he learned the combat technique by himself while just playing with air currents. The man skeptically suggested testing it in practice. "Have you already mastered the wind blade?" The teacher nearly choked in shock upon seeing the student's stance. Suddenly, a trio of goblins jumped out at them, and Mars calmly stepped forward. The creatures froze in fear. The boy quickly laid out the plan. As soon as the creatures enter the strike zone, he will hit with the wind blade, and the last one will be chopped down by Ike with a sword. The boy suddenly threw his arm out, clearly aiming at the enemy's necks. The deadly stream of air burst from his palm. An invisible strike at a crazy speed slit the goblins' throats. The bodies collapsed lifelessly under the teacher's excited exclamation and the stunned gaze of another student. The mentor casually suggested clearing out a few more monsters and going home, to which the guys unanimously agreed. He warmly patted both little ones on the head, sincerely praising them for their work. The space tore apart from the lightning-fast lunge. A hand reached out over the pile of smoldering ash, clutching a surviving crystal. The wind whistled through the mountain wilderness. Ike forcefully lowered the sword. His younger brother thrust his hand forward, releasing a burst of magic. White flash. The light slowly faded. A slain goblin lay on the grass. Ike was stunned and froze. The monster's body crumbled to dust, and the boy's palm was enveloped in light. A system window just popped up in the air. He reached the second level, enhancing all his attributes. The mentor calmly called them home, and the little one enthusiastically greeted his older brother. In the following days, the younger one ate vigorously and trained his skills, burning with impatience to become stronger as well. Later in the forest, he resolutely frowned, determined to achieve his level today. A pack of hungry, cackling goblins simply shoved them aside. He fearlessly held out his palms towards the crowd of monsters. The blonde boy unleashed a powerful wave of energy that scattered the crowd of goblins in one sweep. Before his eyes, a statistics window flashed with the coveted second level. The man with the staff smiled warmly, greeting the little one on this significant achievement. The young wizard stared in astonishment at his hands, unable to believe his own success. In the clearing among dozens of dead monsters, the squad leader suddenly pondered their anomalous number. His gaze darkened. 100 dead goblins in 2 days is abnormal. He was determined that this was not normal and that it needed to be reported to the guild. He explained at the headquarters that Almeria had been overrun by monsters, and the guild had issued them a named task due to a lack of hands. The second guy leaned decisively over the table, fully ready to head into battle. At the common table, the commander warned the entire group about the high risks of the upcoming expedition. The girl sharply objected, as instead of weak goblins, a much stronger and more dangerous enemy could be lurking there. However, the young swordsman did not give up and confidently declared that he would easily handle the small fry. In response, the blonde mage simply lowered his head and refused, soberly acknowledging his own weakness. The group leader leaned heavily on the table, trying to make the right decision. By the fireplace, the daughter asked her father to postpone his next task. He smiled warmly and suggested to the children the usual activity, to go monster hunting for the sake of experience. After swirling the drink in the glass, he finally gave up on the named mission. In the forest, a kobold came to meet them, a feeble beast man with pathetic characteristics. However, in a moment, a whole roaring horde emerged from the thicket encircling the trio. The heroes did not engage in an unequal fight and quickly fled. While running, the man glanced back hungrily, planning to stretch the crowd and methodically take down the enemies one by one. A heavy blow with a crunch crushed the enemy. The mentor confidently commanded to crush the horde of dog-headed creatures, throwing 2 young men straight into the battle. He just laughed condescendingly. The blonde boy tensed up. His partner immediately focused. A pack of beasts charged forward with a wild roar. The brunette sharply dove down, avoiding the deadly jaws of 2 monsters at once. And without hesitation, he struck the wolf's snout with a wooden sword. The blonde sliced through several enemies in half with one swift swing. The air was shattered by a series of lightning strikes. Hooray! I leveled up! The brunette exhaled contentedly, throwing the blade over his shoulder. Empty insert. A whole month of exhausting battles has passed. The guys opened the status windows with their highly developed skills, and the senior confidently stated that it was time to go home. The boys calmly walked through the forest away from the black smoke left at the site of the destroyed enemy. On the way, the boy wondered if it was finally time to tell his family about his heavenly eye. Mars shone with joy. Now he had access to the skill of analysis. At home, he called his mom and dad. A calm family dinner. The parents were frozen in astonishment. The boy carelessly chewed on the salad, casually adding that from now on he can even see the statuses of things. The father broke out in a cold sweat and cautiously asked if his son could read other people's references. Mars quietly addressed him. The alarm instantly disappeared. The adults twirled in embraces out of pride for the child, while the older brother gave a thumbs up. But the little one quickly turned the conversation to serious matters and suggested embarking on an expedition to Almeria to clear the forest of goblins. The head of the family agreed that it was time to deal with this threat. The boy stood confidently by his own. The mother and father exchanged glances and supported the plan, warmly noting how quickly their sons had grown. The man confidently stated that he would take on the named task tomorrow, and the boy readily responded. The next morning, they loaded into the cart, recalling how warmly the clients had thanked them. The woman anxiously watched them leave, pleading for them to take care of themselves. On the way, the little one asked what lies further to the west and heard about an old mine abandoned even before his birth. While the cart was slowly rolling down the road, a goblin was already watching them hungrily from the bushes. Beside the road stood a shattered warning sign. The travelers continued on peacefully, unaware that just nearby a burned corpse was smoldering on the ground. Upon reaching the hill, they stood stunned. A whole settlement below was literally teeming with dozens of goblins. A heavy step shook the ground, and the crowd of goblins fearfully looked up. 3 uninvited guests loudly called from the roof. Isekai'D did not hesitate and struck with magic right in the center of the gathering of monsters. The young man suddenly threw out his hand, burning the front monsters alive. The rest of the crowd became enraged and all together rushed at the audacious ones. At that moment, the square was engulfed by a massive barrage of explosions. The fire ruthlessly mowed down the enemy ranks. The father and his little son also joined the battle, ultimately reducing the horde to ashes. Having gathered the bags of magical stones, the boy checked the system with satisfaction. The level was raised. Suddenly, he got distracted and sharply called for his father. The hero stood frozen in shock. Their path was blocked by gigantic double doors. With a prolonged creak, the doors began to open. From the darkness of the passage, a giant bald monster stared at them menacingly. A burly hobgoblin with staggering strength and endurance stats blocked their path. The senior commanded to first eliminate the small fry and only then tackle the giant. While the mages swept away the horde of ordinary goblins with powerful waves, the young swordsman charged straight at the leader. The monster noticed the target. With a fierce roar, the hobgoblin swung its clawed paws to crush the attacker. Not a shadow of fear in the boy's eyes. The monster snarled in a frenzied roar. The swordsman pushed off the ground and soared into the air, raising his weapon high. But the giant suddenly swatted away. A heavy blow sent the young man far into the grass. He instantly jumped to his feet and rushed forward again at the shout of the little one. "Mars, aim for the eyes!" The goblin grinned fiercely. The creature lunged forward, menacingly extending its claws. The boy gripped the sword tightly. A lunge forward. The lightning strike split the monster's face, causing it to clutch its eyes. The man praised his sons for their work and led them further when suddenly something flashed above. After the clash, the young man and his companion stopped in front of the massive doors. The boy gazed in wonder at his trophy, a huge magical stone. Suddenly, the man froze in alarm. A new goblin jumped out from above, but the young man quickly ducked, drawing his blade for an attack. His gaze became icy. Behind the door, a dark portal of the labyrinth swirled. If the monsters start crawling out of there, it will turn into a real disaster. However, the satellite simply smiled calmly and thought that it was worth reporting this nursery to the higher-ups. The young man asked about the plan, and the leader calmly suggested surveying the area. 3 seekers set off down the echoing stone corridor towards the massive gates. Stopping in front of the iron bars, the senior ordered to check only this area and to return. The heavy door creaked open. The team ventured deeper into the dungeon, leaving behind bags of loot. The leader cautiously peeked around the corner and froze. 3 figures in cloaks stood by the altar. The monsters suspected something, and the system highlighted their earth magic skills. He stepped back against the wall, warning the little ones that dealing with wizards would be troublesome. Hearing about the goblin wizards, the guys immediately drew their weapons. The man commanded to destroy the enemies before they could read the spell and charged into the attack. All 3 rushed forward swiftly. The goblins only gasped in fright upon noticing the ambush. The next moment, the elder swung and hit the monster in the face with a stick. Right behind him, the young swordsman struck his blade at the target. Mars struck the obstacle with force, breaking a path forward. The dust of the saw has not yet settled, but the dark-haired boy has already joyfully shouted. Behind the wall was a chest of treasures. Understood. Mars responded immediately. However, the High Mage quickly held him back and ordered to first scan the find for traps. The analysis yielded an unusual result. The contents of the chest depended solely on luck. The boy turned around and reassured the team that there was no danger here. The metal latch clicked quietly. "I understand." The young man nodded intently. The leader smiled and gave the go-ahead to open. The lid flipped open and Mars widened his eyes. Inside shone a fire bracelet with a significant boost to magic. The dark-haired mage triumphantly raised his fist in the air, anticipating how this thing would stir his flames. The trio stopped in front of the massive guild building. A tall man with a cane confidently approached the counter with 2 boys and stated that they needed to see the guild master. The worker looked at the kids in surprise but received a stern reply. "They are going with him." In the guildmaster's office, he greeted Zig, praising him for a job well done. The gray guildmaster with a scar frowned and sharply asked who they had brought to him. The man introduced the boys as his sons, and the dark-haired Ike and the blonde Mars politely greeted him. After that, the conversation instantly became serious. The master of the office introduced himself as Ralph Sargent. The father reported that the ordinary building in the abandoned village had turned into a labyrinth that was already teeming with hobgoblins and wizards. What? The shocked old man could only utter. The situation looked critical. The dungeon had just begun to expand, and if nothing was done, problems would be inevitable. The man added that he intends to personally report this threat to Count Carmelie. But in the end, he stunned the old man with another request, to register the little ones as official adventurers. It turned out that during the reconnaissance, these two confidently repelled the monster attacks, and without their strength, the father would never have made it out of there with the information. The man calmly listed his son's abilities. Ike wields a sword, a spear, and fire, while Mars has mastered the wind. The gray registrar suspiciously scratched his head, as in front of him stood mere children. Instead of excuses, they simply released a thick flame and sharp gusts of wind in the office. The bewildered old man shouted and ordered to immediately register both as adventurers. The boys' faces lit up. Thick shadows slowly covered the roofs. The windows of the houses dissolved into the darkness. The city froze. Only someone's loud, grateful exclamation at farewell broke the silence. During the day in the clearing, Ike skillfully knocked Mars to the ground during a duel with wooden swords. The yard was filled with ringing battle cries. The winner extended his hand to his brother and firmly assured him that one day Mars would definitely surpass him. A familiar voice interrupted them. Their father returned home and approached his sons with a warm smile. The man gathered the team at the table and calmly stated that they would divide the reward among the three of them. The light-haired boy immediately refused the money. Instead, he asked to be taught earth magic. His friend was also not against being left without coins, contentedly pointing to his brand-new fiery bracelet. The adults sincerely laughed at such childlike selflessness, and the leader gave in, promising the little one lessons. A short pause hung in the air. 2 E-rank adventurer cards landed on the table. The guys couldn't hold back their joyful exclamation. However, the main conversation was ahead. The man immediately became serious and moved on to a personal request from Count Carmel. They were offered to join a dangerous maze research with a real title of Baron at stake. The light-haired one agreed without hesitation. The brunette immediately supported him. The woman smiled warmly and confirmed that one does not refuse such an opportunity. Having received unanimous agreement, the leader nodded in satisfaction. It was time to get to work. Soon their squad merged into a large caravan that slowly stretched along the dusty road to the mountain castle. Half a year of a long journey passed before they finally set foot on the cobblestones of the bustling city. The light-haired boy was proudly boasting about his rich loot, while the older partner was already calling everyone to lunch. In the city, the squad was warmly welcomed. Passers-by gladly greeted them and thanked them for their work. As soon as the group Bluethorn stopped, a girl rushed towards them with a happy shout, taking the little ones away. The estate of Baron Bryant. The man opposite sternly ordered to prepare, because from now on they would have to manage with only 4. The guys exchanged glances and agreed without a trace of fear. Sitting at the table, the group leader announced a new plan. It was time to descend much deeper into the labyrinth. A short question about readiness echoed behind the massive doors. The moon quietly dissolved in the stone corridor. The commander gave the order, and the quartet of adventurers moved forward. On the threshold, a whole army of goblins led by an ogre was waiting for them. The elders calmly asked if the little ones, Ike and Mars, could handle it. Instead of hesitation, the guys confidently took a step towards the horde. Both instantly took off from the spot. The monsters with a scream rushed towards them. A solid wave of monsters was approaching at a furious speed. Mars gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the weapon. He crashed into the crowd at full speed, scattering the front goblins like rags with one wide sweep. At that moment, goblin mages emerged from behind the infantry, unleashing a volley of blinding rays. Mars did not retreat and cold-bloodedly sliced through the magical charges right in midair. Meanwhile, Ike suddenly jumped out from behind him, quickly spinning his staff. The hostile sorcerers could only stare in shock, unable to react to the sudden counterattack. The blonde suddenly dove forward, sliding across the floor. The boy turned sharply, and the blade clinked with sparks against the stone. A burly goblin loomed over him, raising its clawed paw to strike. Aimed for the eyes, and the boy swiftly struck with the dagger from a distance. The monster roared and grabbed its muzzle. Blood splattered from the cut eye. At that moment, the senior partner suddenly thrust his hand forward. The shining spear pierced the monster's skull with a crack. The goblin fell heavily on his back while the warrior landed softly nearby. The beast's carcass lay still on the stones. Ahead of them was already waiting a wooden chest. The boy blinked in surprise, struggling to catch his breath. The squad moved further down the long stone corridor. The man smiled broadly, pleased with the quick victory. The boy shone with happiness, triumphantly raising his new fiery spear with 20 attack points. Ahead in the stone corridor, the rescue bars shone brightly. The squad moved towards the light, finding themselves in a safe zone. They sat on the grass, carefreely chewing their rations and laughing heartily. The blonde boy sweetly fell asleep right on the ground while the system recorded his new 8th level. The descent to the second floor abruptly shattered the idyll. The squad immediately surrounded the crowd of goblins. Deaf walls of the dungeon. Monsters ominously advanced, cutting off all paths of retreat. The girl just smiled boldly. Her tall partner calmly raised his gaze, ready for a good fight, and the youngest hunter squinted and tightly gripped his weapon. The white-haired boy tensed up sharply. The walls shook from the heavy rumble. The way forward was blocked by massive stone doors. Cold metal rings froze on the leaves. The flame of the torches flickered anxiously. The travelers were stunned as they stopped in front of the gigantic gates in the hall, completely covered with the bodies of slain goblins. Suddenly, the doors began to open and the young man with the spear stood frozen in shock. With a terrifying creak, the gate opened into complete darkness. From the darkness, a fresh horde of monsters emerged, behind which loomed a gigantic armored giant in a horned helmet, holding a massive axe on his shoulder. The characteristics of a huge goblin general popped up in front of the guy, causing him to freeze. The adults confidently stepped forward and the man suggested that the students carefully watch their joint fight. He instantly activated the earth fortress, raising stone crystals around himself. The woman with a predatory smile caught the ice bill. At the general's roar, a swarm of small goblins charged into the attack. With a rumble on the path, 2 massive domes grew up from the monsters. The creatures immediately rushed at the barriers. Axes rained down on the magical shields. At that moment, the coaches simultaneously commanded to strike. From beneath the ground, a forest of stone and ice stakes erupted, piercing through the crowd of enemies. Sharp blades mercilessly tore apart the flesh of the monsters. The boys were left speechless by such a brutal punishment. The last giant spike tore upwards with a crack. The goblin general wheezed hoarsely, shuddering from the pain in his pierced chest. The monster stared blankly with empty eyes. Her massive body thudded face first into the stone, joining the ranks of the already fallen enemies. The sorceress smiled contentedly at her partner, mentally assessing their joint work. Young students ran up to them, excitedly shouting about how incredible that fight was. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched labyrinth city of Grantham, tranquility reigned. Clarice was gently stroking the fluffy little animal and smiling happily. She was distracted by a distressing scream. A boy was rushing down the street with news of trouble. They hurried to the infirmary, where the wounded lay in rows. In the infirmary, a wounded man with a bandaged eye awkwardly asked her to tend to him, to which the girl readily agreed. Clarice stood over the bed and a bright magical spear flared up between her palms. She confidently smiled at the patient and activated the healing magic. A massive orc in armor emerged from the magical circle and the small guard nearby flinched. Torches flared up one by one on the stone wall. The mentors warned, "Here goblin generals are reborn again and again." 2 young men prepared their weapons while the mentors from the portal cheerfully wished them good luck. The voice commanded to defeat all enemies alone, and before the boys grew an entire army of giants clad in steel. The brunette nodded briefly and both of them rushed straight into the crowd. The monsters of the lair bared their weapons and raised them. The giant swung his blade, causing the blonde to fall on his back to escape the edge, while his partner attacked in midair. They circled over the enemies, delivering strikes from the air. And then hell began. The orcs smeared the blonde against the walls, beat him and threw him on the floor again and again for a whole year. A young and sounding conversationalist soared again, and the young man instinctively leaned back. But this time he instantly pushed off the ground and, with a run-up, punched the monster right in the face. The giant's jaw cracked loudly and grotesquely twisted from the force of the blow. The orc blindly swung in response, forcing the boy to dive under the blade again. The sword struck the body of the horned monster with a swing. The hail of merciless blows tore apart the monster until time made a swift leap a whole year forward. The blond young man struck the head of the next monster with his sword in a high jump. Now the battlefield was covered with solid mountains of shattered stone golems. During this time, the squad significantly leveled up. Their levels increased and the boys' mana reserve reached 5,000. The ruddy-haired leader cheerfully commanded to move on. He surveyed the cleared area and praised the team for their excellent work. Suddenly, all 4 tensed and stared ahead. Before them, gloomy stairs led to the 3rd floor. The travelers stopped before the massive gates adorned with a demon's visage, immediately realizing this was the lair of the boss. The leader abruptly swung open the heavy doors, calling for an advance. Someone's hand confidently rested on the wall with a short sigh of readiness. The squad entered the vast hall where the ruler sat on the throne, his calm guarded by two giant knights in heavy armor. The path was blocked by the goblin lord in massive armor. He gripped the two-handed sword tightly, and on the throne behind, a horned demon with a painted face lounged like a master. The air vibrated. The monster sat relaxed with one leg crossed over the other, openly disdainful of the guests. From the darkness, the mad eyes of the Goblin King gleamed, a monster capable of regeneration and magical summoning. Is he using magic? The blonde tensed up, while the others stared at the boss in shock. The girl froze. Under the king's deadly gaze, the boys were paralyzed by fear. One of them fearfully backed away, hopelessly calling for mom and dad. At that moment, two armored guards sprang into action and struck. The armored guard had already drawn the blade, but the guys managed to react. They rushed towards each other, and weapons clashed with sparks in a fierce confrontation. Both froze with their mouths agape as suddenly, right in front of them from above, someone's legs in black boots appeared. Two young men jumped past the armored guard. They charged straight at the horned giant, who instantly brought down his massive sword on them. The heavy blade shattered the stone floor, but the blonde barely managed to jump aside. The boys struck simultaneously. One aimed a spear upward, while the other attacked with a dagger from below, but the monster easily deflected the attack with its weapon. At that moment, a bright mark suddenly appeared on the giant's shoulder. The skin has smoked. All three jumped back sharply, breaking the distance. A second's pause, and the young men surged forward again while the monster leaped towards them hungrily. The giant swung his arms wide, forcing the heroes to duck and dodge the deadly sweeps. The blonde took a risk and dove right under the enemy's hand, drawing all his attention to himself. This was enough. The spear-bearer charged and drove the weapon straight into the giant's chest. But he just grinned ominously. His healthy paw gripped the spear's shaft tightly. The monster didn't even flinch from the deep wound, while the boy froze in horror, realizing that he had fallen into a trap himself. The horned monster swung a giant cleaver down onto the floor, forcing the boys to jump aside in different directions. The young man in black grabbed his wounded shoulder in pain, rasping that he had lost his vigilance. He sank heavily to one knee, and his friends were already rushing to him with a shout of "Ike!" Horror was frozen in the girl's eyes. The lightning whistle of the blade. The blonde young man rushed to his wounded brother, but the monster suddenly jumped in front of him. The enemy completely blocked the path with his body and massive sword. He won't allow healing. The monster in the hut snarled, gripping the bizarre weapon more tightly. The boy decisively drew his own blade. If so, he would face the fight one-on-one. The demon struck him with a devastating blow from above, but the young man managed to raise a strong block. He clenched his teeth to the grinding point, barely enduring the insane weight of foreign steel. The force of the blow knocked him back. His shoes plowed deep furrows into the stone slabs of the corridor. The next blind attack of the monster with a trail of sparks crashed into the wall. While the giant loomed with his cleaver, the young man crouched low to the ground and prepared for a leap. The enemy and the young man rushed from their places and ran towards each other. They simultaneously leaped in a jump to strike. The whistle cut through the air. The young man's fingers gripped the hilt of the sword tightly. The horned monster menacingly grinned in anticipation of victory. The boy's face remained icy. The giant blade swung powerfully horizontally, but the young man sharply dove right under the very edge. With one continuous motion, he slid up close to the enemy, deeply slicing into his side. Shock instantly wiped the smile off the monster's face. The young man calmly glanced at him over his shoulder. Suddenly, the monster summon was triggered. A dense crowd of armored warriors with shields materialized around the boy from the air. The wounded giant was covered in sweat, grimacing in pain. He hurriedly jumped back, breaking the distance. With a frenzied roar, the monster began to form a complex magical circle right in front of its maw. With a confident smile, he sharply swung his sword, and a gigantic tornado burst forth from the blade with a deafening roar. The horned monster was covered in slime, its eyes bulging with animal terror. The weakened monster crawled pitifully across the stone floor, trying to escape from the young man with the knife. The boy simply smiled carefreely, realizing that the enemy had completely exhausted their mana. Suddenly, a system window popped up in front of his eyes. Mars has achieved 2 rare titles. He entered the top 10 wind mages and became a certified goblin killer. From the victorious chest, he retrieved the Ifrit's cloak with solid bonuses to defense and magic. The young man sharply threw a heavy bag over his shoulder, from which monster horns were sticking out. The rope was tightly stretched. The news about the 1 titles caused outright shock in the team. The partner, with a joyful scream, threw herself around Mars's neck, tightly embracing him. A brief moment of silence. High in the sky, the clouds floated lazily. In a cozy room, the family silently had breakfast at the wooden table. Thus began a new day in the labyrinth city of Grantham. At breakfast, the man kindly asked Clarissa not to overexert herself. The girl cheerfully waved goodbye to her family and set off on her errands. She smiled warmly while finishing her breakfast. Her palms softly shimmered with the magic of healing. The local clinic was already bustling with activity. Clarice routinely bandaged the wounds of the fighters, hearing only sincere gratitude in response. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, she exhaled heavily and called for the next one. The stream of wounded did not stop. The girl tried to convince herself that the labyrinth was not yet threatened by an oversaturation of monsters. But just outside, she overheard a troubling conversation among passers-by. A kobold had already been seen in the city. Tension hung like an invisible shadow over the rooftops of the houses. Clarisse silently stopped in front of the tall building with columns. The rumors about the labyrinth wouldn't leave her mind. Suddenly, a sharp bang sounded from behind. She quickly turned around, her eyes wide open in surprise. The girl was relaxing in the spacious communal bath. A few more guests were relaxing in the spacious bathroom. She blissfully closed her eyes, absorbing every second of this tranquility. But anxious thoughts wouldn't let go. She lazily ran her hand through the warm water. Watching others, she quietly hoped that their vacation wouldn't be ruined by another mishap. The girl submerged her nose in the water, blowing bubbles and pondering the saturation of the labyrinth. Later, in a dark alley, she was surprised by a fat cat peeking out of a barrel. She had just stepped out into the fresh air, sweetly reminiscing about the perfect vacation. The eyes instantly sparkled with childlike delight. Forgetting everything, the girl joyfully threw herself at devouring his huge, fluffy belly. The cat merely squinted contentedly, allowing gentle squeezes on its fluffy cheeks. The number of monsters in the labyrinth always had a clear limit, but there were so many of them that the creatures no longer fit inside and crawled outside. This breakthrough was called the saturation of the labyrinth. The blonde listened attentively and nodded thoughtfully. The mustached warrior chuckled good-naturedly, checking if she had grasped the essence. Sitting with them at the cafe table, the girl hesitantly agreed. Zadoro Vanni waved it off. Such things happen rarely. There's no need to worry. Suddenly, her eyes sparkled with delight at the giant strawberry dessert. The man suggested eating faster, calling it a gratitude for the treatment. The girl joyfully squinted, savoring each spoonful. Meanwhile, an armored squad lined up near the dungeon gates, ready to clear out the monsters and stop the next saturation. The commander of the Order of Count Beetle loudly commanded the knights to give all their strength for the sake of the common people. The warriors struck with their spears, shouting a battle cry. The heavy bars of the dungeon ominously trembled. The warrior turned sharply. The guards behind bars did not understand what was happening. Silence. Behind the massive gate, a dull, ominous rumble was growing, and countless horde of goblins poured out of the tunnel like an avalanche. The man's eyes widened, and his face was drenched in cold sweat. The torn gates flew apart, and a wave of goblins swept him off his feet right in the middle of a desperate call to not be afraid. Monsters surged in an endless stream. The creatures attacked the soldiers, tearing apart their fragile formation despite orders to hold their ground. Someone's eye blinked in animal terror at the realization of the disaster. The mustache guard froze, instantly recognizing this nightmare. He immediately found himself by the signal bell at the top of the tower. A deafening alarm rang out, and the man shouted about the overcrowding of the labyrinth and the need for immediate evacuation. The townspeople panicked and fled in a rush. "Clarice, run home!" shouted the mustache giant, turning his back. The girl froze in confusion, whispering her parents' names in fear. The man tensed up, sensing the approach of trouble. Clarisse sadly lowered her head. The girl clenched her fists tightly. Suddenly, a desperate scream rang out. They begged for help for the wounded adventurer. She instantly sprang to her feet and rushed to the victim. Chunks of earth and weapons flew into the air. The blonde swordsman sliced through the goblin with the sharp swing of his blade, and Vroussan struck another monster with a powerful punch right into the pavement. A fierce battle raged in the square. Adventurers clashed with a horde of goblins while Clarisse fought her way to the rear. The girl leaned over the wounded man and immediately activated healing magic. Fists collided with a dull thud. The residents warmly thanked for the rescue, although the bald warrior was still sweating profusely. Something stirred in the beams under the roof. A swarm of goblins crawled out of the shadows. The fox warrior clenched his fists. The little girl was working hard, so they couldn't let her down. The horde rushed straight at the unarmed townspeople. The mustached man turned around in confusion. The crowd, horrified, broke from its place and fled. But ahead, another wave of monsters crashed down on them, brutally knocking the first fugitives off their feet. People in panic turned around and rushed back. The fox warrior sharply commanded everyone to retreat, deciding to hold back the onslaught alone. Vroussan was shocked and stared wide-eyed. The fox pushed away the nearest goblin with his bare hands and shouted to call for reinforcements. The townspeople found themselves in a dead end in the square, hopelessly trapped by a tight ring of beasts. Her eyes widened sharply. "Clarisse!" A desperate scream cut through the air. Leaning over the wounded, the girl healed him and silently prayed for her parents to remain safe. She turned around. A frightened girl was using her last strength to hold up her severely injured father. Someone's palm weakly grasped her wrist, pleading not to waste her strength on him. Clarice abruptly turned to her first patient, fiercely promising to cure him right now. She stumbled in confusion. The man forced a smile through the pain and asked her to save the adventurers. At that moment, a bald fighter nearby howled in pain. Another mercenary grabbed his wounded side, angrily demanding to be treated first. On the other hand, they begged for immediate healing in a panic. The street erupted into chaos. Wounded soldiers aggressively pushed forward, shouting over each other and enclosing a frightened girl with her father in a tight circle. Someone's authoritative shout to disperse the crowd abruptly cut off the noise. The crowd instantly parted, obediently allowing the pompous little man in an expensive frock coat to pass. The pompous nobleman unconditionally stated that aristocrats should be treated first. He irritably repeated his demand. The healer froze in confusion. The man rolled up his sleeve and ordered her to move faster. But his terrible wound turned out to be just a tiny bruise. The girl awkwardly smiled and replied that it was more important to save the seriously injured adventurers right now. She politely bowed, promising to examine his scratch later. The healer calmly turned away, and here the aristocrats slapped her hard. The crowd froze. People were shockingly covering their mouths with their hands, not believing their eyes. The nobleman's face twisted with wild rage. The girl grabbed her burning cheek, staring in shock at her attacker. "You should be executed for mockery," he roared and swung the heavy stick again at the healer who had been knocked to the ground. A sharp clatter of metal shattered the silence, and the girl on the pavement bewilderedly pressed her palms to her burning cheeks. A stout nobleman with a drawn sword stood over the wounded man who shielded the girls. The eyes widened in horror. With a lacerated back, the man humbly bowed before the portly aristocrat, squeezing out pleas for forgiveness. His face contorted in pain when a child's scream suddenly rang out. The aristocrat was enraged that someone dared to interfere with him. The wounded man collapsed face down on the pavement, and his little daughter rushed towards him. Ignoring the armed executioner, trembling, the father whispered with his last strength only a thought about his child. Hands shone over the bloody wound. The light of magic flared brighter. The girl healer desperately tried to save the dying one while the child nearby was choking on tears. But the glow suddenly faded. The healer confessed in despair that her mana had completely run out. The corpulent rich man roared, demanding immediate death. He mercilessly raised the sword over the wounded and the girls, pronouncing their death sentence on the spot. The execution was abruptly interrupted by a burst of chaos. A wild horde of goblins surged into the city street, sweeping away everyone in their path. The fat aristocrat raised his sword over the defenseless in front of the terrified crowd. Suddenly, he turned sharply. A predatory gaze fixed on him from the crowd. The man stood frozen with his raised blade, bewildered. The blond young man with a run-up slammed his palm into his torso, knocking the hefty man off his feet with a powerful burst of energy. The boy smoothly landed in a combat stance. He did not take his eyes off the enemy. The witnesses stood frozen with their mouths open. Ignoring the knocked-out attacker, the rescuer calmly approached the victims. He touched the head of the wounded man and applied healing. As soon as his breathing steadied, the young man picked up the sword from the cobblestones. Meanwhile, the fat man was moaning pitifully in a deep blackout. The saved one fell asleep peacefully while the boy with a slight smile threw the blade over his shoulder. He energetically postponed all explanations for later. A confrontation with the goblins was still ahead. The silence of the peaceful town was shattered by a sharp rumble. The mustached townsman froze with his mouth open. The people nearby froze. Incredible, this boy? The light-haired girl could only exhale, not believing her own eyes. And the young man stood relaxed with a barely noticeable smile. He calmly walked down the street past dozens of goblin corpses. The boy cut them all by himself. Suddenly, the pavement shook with the heavy clatter of hooves. The knights clad in armor charged at full speed. Meanwhile, the townspeople were joyfully surrounding their savior while he awkwardly scratched the back of his head. A sudden movement, and someone's hand firmly grasped his wrist. The girl decisively pulled him along. Another task awaited them. The crowd in the square buzzes, calling for Count Beetle. And it was then that a knightly squad burst into the square, and the commander immediately shouted, demanding a report on the wounded. A plump man in an embroidered coat ran out of the crowd, calling for Count Beetle. The count ordered to treat the severely wounded first, and the bruises will wait until the last. He was hysterically pointing at a tiny scratch on his arm, demanding to be treated first. The blonde count abruptly turned around and fiercely shouted at Baron Dams, ordering him to be quiet. The Baron was bewildered, pitifully babbling about his status as an aristocrat. Suddenly, his face twisted in horror. Around Damsa, lightning strikes hit with a crack. He winced in pain, cursing through his teeth the cause of his troubles. Meanwhile, on the sunlit city square, sincere words of gratitude were heard. The tiled roofs shimmered peacefully in the rays of light. The rescued villagers bowed low to the young swordsman, but the boy modestly waved them off. The blonde girl from the group of adventurers kept a watchful eye on the rescuer. She froze in place from the sudden realization. While her burly partner voiced his amazement at the young man's combat prowess, the girl was shocked by something else. This mighty warrior turned out to be her peer. The girl smiled warmly and sincerely thanked. The boy froze upon hearing pure Japanese from her lips. She thanked for the help once again. His eyes sparkled with tears of joy. He barely exhaled that he was infinitely happy. A saving thought flashed through her mind. She too could be reborn. He smiled with relief. The memory pierced with pain, a snow-covered street, screams, a dull thud from the truck, and her bloodied face before death. He held her tightly in his arms, causing the girl to be a little surprised and blush. Finally, I found you, came the confident step towards me. Through tears of joy, she confessed that in her past life, she was 20-year-old Aoi, and here she became 7-year-old Clarice. The boy with a smile replied that he used to be Yuto, but now he is the same 7-year-old Mars. Their touching moment was suddenly interrupted by a shocked exclamation. Nearby stood a man and a woman tied up with a thick rope who awkwardly asked if the children had a free minute. Recovering slightly from the surprise, the children introduced themselves as Mars and Clarice, while the strange bound pair politely apologized and introduced themselves as Gray and Arena. The boy firmly grabbed the girl by the shoulders and shook her anxiously while two adults silently watched them. She just stood there in confusion, making him scratch his head in bewilderment. Suddenly, a shocked exclamation rang out. Could he really be from the kingdom of Barkus? The conversation moved under the roof of the large house. The big guy at the table was so surprised that he was sweating, asking how the little one even made it to their region. The man stunned the boy with the news. They were now in the labyrinth city of Grantham, far to the east of the neighboring kingdom of Zarkum. Frowning, the young man began to tell how he set out to explore the dungeon. Together with his brother Ake, he showed the servant the magical wall when suddenly he touched it, and his hand was sucked in completely. The boy had only managed to order his father to be silent about it when the space blinked, throwing him onto a hill in front of a strange city. The worst part is that their kingdoms were in the midst of a bloody war. Risking everything, he came to the house of the locals and laid out his legend at the table. The hostess almost revealed his status, starting with the word master, but timely bit her tongue and greeted him as Mars. The head of the family chuckled good-naturedly and offered the young man to stay with them for as long as needed. Their daughter quietly tapped her finger on the table, drawing her father's attention. Mars smiled sincerely and thanked for such a necessary shelter at this time. Sweat was running down the boy's back. He was mentally glad that the hostess kept her tongue behind her teeth and remembered the made-up name. The girl innocently squinted and asked if she could talk to the guest. She looked at her father expectantly, who blinked his eyes in confusion. The man nervously turned away to the cupboard, forcing out a permission from himself with difficulty. She immediately grabbed Mars by the sleeve and decisively pulled him into her room, while her father helplessly reached out his hands towards them. As soon as they sat on the bed, all friendliness disappeared. She looked seriously at the guy and directly asked what exactly he had seen then. A cloak hung lonely on the wall. The girl frowned. The boy blinked in surprise. He smiled at her carefree while old acquaintances and fragments of past life flickered before his eyes. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp metallic clatter from outside. She whispered a warning. The robber is also in this world, so it's better not to speak Japanese in public. Both rushed to the window. He tightly squeezed her palm. The boy's eyes widened at what he saw. At the bottom, the cobblestones marked the step of a squad of armed knights, whom he initially mistook for goblins. The face was hidden in the shadow, but in a moment, the lips stretched into a predatory smile. They cautiously peered out from behind the wall. The boy firmly declared that he was going to help. The boy calmly stated that he was going to help. The girl exclaimed indignantly, "He came from an enemy country." She was frozen in complete shock. The young man turned around with a bright smile and simply replied that people are the same everywhere. Hearing his promise to protect everyone, especially her, the girl blushed deeply. She abruptly hugged him, hiding her face on his chest with a grateful whisper. Her hands tightly clasped around his back. The door creaked open, revealing a startled man and woman. They stared in astonishment at the sword in the young man's hands. The boy slung the sword over his shoulder and casually confirmed his intention to go. Dvorvany gloomily explained the situation. Goblins had appeared again. The young man calmly walked away down the corridor, leaving behind the man with his warnings that no one would protect him here. The host frowned, throwing a harsh threat after him in case the guest turned out to be a spy. With a confident smile, the guy slung the sword over his shoulder and declared that he was ready. He suddenly took off from the spot, raising powerful whirlwinds of dust on the city street. In an instant, the young man was already sharply braking in front of the massive wooden doors, keeping his weapon at the ready. With a focused gaze and a blade in hand, he rushed forward again. The boy flew onto the forest road, startling the knight and the local wealthy man, and shouted an apology on the go. The stout man instantly turned red with rage and shouted, recognizing the damned thief in him. The young man was not at all embarrassed. He smiled broadly and happily asked if he could join them. The commander shouted sharply at the young man, demanding that he get off the battlefield and not interfere. However, the boy didn't even move, recognizing the stolen sword in the knight's hands. One of the warriors stared in shock at the impudent one. The wounded soldier panicked and stopped the count. It turned out that this boy had just single-handedly cut down an entire pack of goblins. The young man smiled contentedly, stating that he did not intend to stand aside. Setting aside his pride, the count asked to borrow this power from them, but the battle continued. Just behind the commander, another fighter fell with a clatter. A heavy stick with a crunch shattered someone's helmet. Blair resignedly glanced at the fallen people. It was the end. His legs treacherously gave way. In front of him swarmed an innumerable horde of monsters, but he could not retreat. Behind him were defenseless villagers. Gathering the remnants of his will, the knight faced the giant leader one-on-one. He gripped the sword tightly, ready to die right here to hold the monster back for even a moment. A bitter smile of calmness froze on his exhausted face. The giant goblin leader tensed his mountains of muscle, preparing to crush the insolent young man. The leader raised a huge club above his head. The monster swung its club, but the boy swiftly dove right under its arm. One swift lunge, and the sword pierced through the crowd, easily knocking the giant off his feet. The young man relaxedly lowered his weapon and remarked with a smile that this was the last one. The commander of the knights was frozen in silent shock. The boy slung the sword over his shoulder and advised everyone to calm down. He reminded the warriors that the count was already waiting for them. The knights barely got up from the ground, thanking their savior in unison. At the city gates, a crowd greeted them, deafeningly chanting glory to the great swordsman. The commander happily waved off the upcoming disputes with Baron Dams to immediately discuss Mars's well-deserved reward. He was sincerely pleased with this offer. A forged emblem hung on the facade of the spacious wooden building. This was the local adventurers' guild. The Fox Guild master with a scar on his forehead seriously thanked the boy on behalf of the entire city. However, the guest skipped the pleasantries and immediately stated that he had a business matter to discuss. The young man calmly introduced himself as Mars. A man in a suit nearby dryly asked him to state his name for the record. Both officials tensed up. Mars got to the point and asked if there was any way to stop the growth of the labyrinth. And when exactly will he finally be conquered? The guild master sighed heavily. The anomaly can only be stopped by complete cleansing, but there is one problem. The boy listened attentively. The old man admitted that due to the war, the country is critically lacking fighters, which is why the advance in the dungeon has come to a complete standstill. Without a second of hesitation, Mars declared that he would carry out the task himself. The leaders burst into a scream. Going there alone is pure suicide, as even a whole group of S-rank adventurers did not return from there. They stared at the guy in shock, covered in cold sweat and not believing their own ears. The young man didn't have time to finish. The door swung open, and the girl at the threshold demanded to be taken with him. The boy breathed out her name in astonishment. The mustached leader was about to burst with indignation. Letting a girl with holy magic into the labyrinth was pure suicide. Clarice understood that inaction was even more terrifying, and Mars firmly stated that he would go with her. The boy calmly asked to be let go with her. Vitor eased the tension. He placed his hand on the commander's shoulder and promised the children his full support. Busan resignedly exhaled and gave up. Then Victor directly asked what Mars wanted as a reward. Instead of gold, the boy asked for just one thing: to protect the Rampart family, which greatly shocked Clarice. Vitor nodded seriously and gave an ironclad guarantee of safety. Having received the word, the children laid out the whole truth about their conflict with the local arrogant nobleman. A deafening night has descended upon the settlement. The silence under the full moon was shattered by a bewildered agreement. Meanwhile, in the office, Vucian had already ordered Victor to immediately register Mars as an official adventurer. The men were stunned as they contemplated the meeting with these amazing children. Mars was preparing for a scandal at home for nothing. Clarissa's parents listened to them with a smile and, without any unnecessary questions, let their daughter embark on a dangerous journey. In the darkness of the room, he couldn't sleep. The desire to return home quickly pulled him into the labyrinth, but the anxiety for the city and Clarice kept him here. The gaze slid over the forgotten jacket on the hanger. The decision became clear. He must make Clarissa much stronger. Only then will she succeed on her own, and he will be able to go conquer the labyrinth with a calm heart. In memory, the touch and the last request of the old mentor to take this burden upon oneself echoed back with a heavy resonance. The next morning, they stood outside in full combat readiness. The system windows illuminated their gear, reliable protection for her and a mithril sword for him. The boy's pupil flashed with a magical pattern. He activated the heavenly eye to assess his partner's real combat potential. But Clarissa just smiled awkwardly, having no idea how to use her power at all. He sighed resignedly and decided to start with the simplest. When the girl examined her own characteristics, she was so surprised that she covered her mouth. She had no idea about her talent for barrier magic. In confirmation, a soft spear of holy light instantly flared up in her palm. In response, a mini tornado swirled above the boy's hand, and he casually remarked that he was actually a wind mage, not a swordsman at all. In Clarissa's eyes, stars of admiration instantly ignited. The boy with a slight smile confirmed her guess. Clarice thoughtfully added that the real secret lies in hard work, and then she directly asked the mentor, how can a person become strong the fastest? Instead of a long theory, he organized a harsh practice. He ordered to kill the goblin by himself. Horror flashed in the girl's eyes. The monster with the club lunged forward while the boy shouted not to stand still. But Clarice just stood there in confusion, barely holding the heavy sword in her hands. The goblin swung and hit with a club. The girl cried out plaintively, miraculously holding onto the block. The mentor silently watched her hands trembling from shock. The boy checked if she was okay, and the girl barely audibly replied that she was unharmed. A tense silence fell. He gave her one last chance to retreat and stay safe. Instead, Clarice bowed low and firmly stated that she would go with him to the very end. With trembling hands, she clutched her skirt, recalling her helplessness on the day the nobleman nearly killed her father. Tears shimmered on her eyelashes, but her voice did not tremble. The girl firmly vowed to gain strength for the sake of protecting her family. Okay, become stronger, came the reply. A restrained smile flickered across the young man's face. Gathering his courage, he looked straight ahead and boldly asked Mars for another chance. The mentor called out for her to get used to the weight of the sword, and the girl obediently nodded. She gripped the hilt of the heavy sword until it creaked. A frenzied goblin with a club was already rushing towards her, but she stubbornly convinced herself that she would manage. The fingers gripped the weapon even tighter. A wide swing, and the huge blade flew straight at the monster. The creature's eyes widened in animal terror. There is no doubt in the gaze, cold steel has deeply pierced the enemy's flesh. One devastating blow cleaved the goblin. Great job, the companion exclaimed joyfully as she gasped for air. The monster with dead weight crashed onto the stone and the girl's hands trembled uncontrollably. The boy blinked in surprise. The adrenaline let go, her legs gave way, and she heavily sank to the ground. Clarice smiled with relief, as if she had shed a whole mountain from her shoulders. Next were the daily exhausting battles, confidently slicing through crowds of monsters. The girl rapidly increased her strength. Together with the new loot, the girl gradually became stronger, joyfully drawing the string of the magical bow. A mysterious bracelet appeared on her leg, restoring her strength simply by walking. They walked leisurely through the streets. The boy noticed that recently many strangers from other cities have been coming to her clinic. Suddenly, he froze sharply. Anxiety flashed in the eyes. He felt someone's heavy gaze on his back and began to look around in the cobbled square. The girl asked worriedly what had happened, but he quickly brushed it off. Aha, she said quietly. They moved on against the backdrop of the Twilight City. The mood instantly improved. The girl happily beamed and suggested going to a restaurant for meat. From the darkness, a cold gaze watched them intently. An unknown figure in a hood silently followed them with his eyes from a hidden alley in the shadows. But ahead of them, a giant warrior in massive armor had already blocked the way. The clouds lazily floated over the stone wall. The mentor nodded at the horned giant. This general she had to defeat on her own. She confidently declared that she would defeat the goblin general on her own. Her level 20 and high combat skills spoke for themselves. An instant rebound back. It's better to keep a distance from such giants. Fingers instinctively rested on the shining string. The horned giant moved forward with difficulty, but the girl didn't even blink. Drawing the bow, she decided to blind the target first. The goblin swayed and grabbed his face while she was already preparing to throw him off balance completely. A precise beam of light struck him directly in the eye beneath the helmet. Without giving the enemy a chance to recover, she released arrow after arrow. The next blow hit the metal backpack with a crash. Another shell pierced through his massive palm. The giant gritted his teeth in searing pain and helpless rage. Having done her job, she smoothly lowered her hand. The girl decisively brandished the blade, keeping her intense gaze fixed on the enemy. The creature's body crashed heavily onto the stone pavement, and the warrior, still not believing it herself, gasped in astonishment that she had won. The tension eased and a genuine smile of relief blossomed on her face. At that very moment, a sharp spike shot out of the gaping maw of the dead monster straight at her. The girl happily raised her arms, ringing out in celebration of her victory. The boy warmly greeted her. He never doubted her success for a moment. The moon of the dungeon has quieted down, so it is time to return for rest. She bowed low, fervently thanking her partner for helping her finally become stronger. Already at the rest stop, the girl sank her teeth into a fresh sandwich with immense pleasure. In the open box, a whole mountain of appetizing food awaited them. With stuffed cheeks, she attributed her wolfish appetite to the tough fight that had drained all her strength. The boy just smiled softly. She squinted with pleasure, continuing to stuff her cheeks with delicious food. This carefree picnic was the last breath of tranquility. Tomorrow they were to venture into the depths of the dangerous labyrinth. In the middle of the conversation, the guy suddenly froze, deeply immersed in his own thoughts. The girl froze in surprise, noticing his intense gaze on her. The next day, at the start of the expedition, they met at the massive gates under the guard of knights. The young man anxiously approached the count and confessed that he had long felt a stranger's gaze on his back, but today the surveillance had become too obvious. Above, Mars noticed a column of heavily armed knights in the forest and sighed to himself. Here they are again. His face instantly turned to stone. In just a moment, the boy put on a wide, carefree smile and happily nodded, pretending to be an obedient fool. The commander of the knights condescendingly advised him to think only about the labyrinth, not even suspecting that Mars had already calculated everything. The heavy stone gates opened with a rumble, swallowing the united squad into the darkness of the dungeon. As soon as the first goblins appeared on the path, the commander ordered to battle. The knights rushed to slash the monsters with a shout, while the teenagers calmly watched from the rear. Reaching the stairs to the lower level, the commander sharply raised his hand. He stated that his people will stay here, and then the children will go on their own. Mars and the girl confidently intercepted the weapon. A dense line of sturdy goblins in heavy armor was already waiting for them on the stairs. A few lightning flashes in the dark corridors, and the monsters shattered into pieces. Stepping over the chopped-up corpses by the massive doors, Mars briefly told his partner to leave the boss to him. On the throne, the giant goblin king grimaced, but Mars calmly drew his sword. Its abnormal characteristics left the monster no chance. Someone's hand gently pushed the heavy door of the dungeon. The path was blocked by the Goblin King, a 2-meter monster with a full health bar and a terrifying aura. The boy simply smiled confidently. His characteristics and colossal mana reserve left the monster no chance. The giant intercepted a huge axe, and the girl behind with a trembling voice squeezed out that this goblin was some other one. The monster grinned fiercely. The girl was frozen in horror. The blow shattered the darkness. But the young man didn't even flinch. The massive blade of the enemy's axe simply broke off and fell to his feet with a clatter. The air vibrated with a frenzied concentration of energy. With a swift swing of his sword, the boy unleashed a giant tornado that instantly reduced the monster to dust. Nervously dripping with sweat, the partner bewilderedly noted the end of the maze and asked to go home. Meanwhile, far away, a smooth aristocrat with a glass was confidently laughing at his perfect plan. Unaware that the knight beside him had already passed sentence, Count Beetle was finished. The sun calmly bathed the luxurious estate of the doomed nobleman in light. In the half-darkness, someone's hand tightly gripped the microphone. For a moment, everything froze. "Count Bill, it is over for you." The merciless verdict rang out and the stern knight in armor clenched his jaw. Blinded by the lust for power, the conspirator threw all his money into the rebellion, hiring 200 thugs to eliminate the knights of Count Beetle. He sat safely, relaxedly sipping wine, and waiting for victorious news. "Knights have been killed," the fat man exclaimed joyfully upon hearing the beginning of the report. He burst into maniacal laughter, already imagining himself as the rightful ruler of the city. As soon as the conversation turned to the fate of the mercenaries, his face twisted in sticky horror. He was struck by a heavy, deadly gaze. The conspirator miserably shrank back in the doorway before the guard and the huge man in armor. It was the Count Beetle himself, completely intact and ready to crush the traitor. Meanwhile, from the darkness of the dungeon, a young swordsman and a girl with a staff calmly emerged. The massive gates of the labyrinth closed shut behind them. The guard was genuinely surprised by their skills while the guy calmly reported on the completed mission. The guard inquired about the situation inside and thanked them for their excellent work. The wind lazily sifted through the leaves of the trees under the calm sky. The young man smiled warmly and offered to escort the girl, explaining that Count Beetle had already returned home. Mars and Clarice arrived at Count Beetle's estate, but instead of a peaceful reception, they saw armed knights and a bound fat man on the floor. The Count joyfully welcomed them back, although Mars had no idea what was going on. The Beetle explained, "While the heroes were clearing the labyrinth, The prisoner named Dams was preparing a coup. The traitors secretly gathered weapons and hired various bandits, but the Count timely uncovered the conspiracy and arrested the entire gang. Hearing his sentence of title confiscation and imprisonment, Dams Barker nearly fainted from shock. The knights dragged the captive to the exit, and the Count was finally able to speak calmly with the guests. Thus, the ambitions of the former baron ended in disgrace. Having dealt with the traitor, Beetle hugged Mars and Clarissa tightly and with relief. He sincerely thanked them and called them the true heroes of the country. In response, Mars simply smiled warmly and contentedly. Then the Count turned to Rampart, not rushing him for any important answer. Zadorvany could not hold back tears of joy. Thanks to the team's success, he will now receive the vacated title of Baron. The clock reminded of the late hour, and the company began to gather. Drenched with excitement, Rampart agreed but warned that he needed to have a serious talk with his family before making a decision. Mars nodded happily. Twilight descended upon the luxurious estate. The Count suggested that the young man wait out the night at his place. In a moment, the guest was already gaping at the table piled with fried meat. At dinner, the Count apologized for having watched him and regretted Dams's prank, while the young man brushed it off, saying everything was fine. He decisively grabbed the fork and declared that it was time to move on to the main course. The aristocrat calmly took a sip of wine. Mars, with a blissful smile, began to indulge in the feast. Suddenly, the master broke the silence by naming the boy's true name and his native kingdom, Farkas, and he immediately added that he should not worry, they have no hostility towards him. Mars has petrified. It has been uncovered. The prince thoughtfully lost his chin. It was impossible to teleport the boy back. Mars had no choice but to reveal the truth about his unsuccessful attempts to register as an adventurer, understanding that help was ready for him. The boy bowed low and sincerely thanked them. The young impotently promised that he would definitely arrange for her return home. The preparation for departure was supposed to take about a week, so he wrote a letter in advance to reassure his relatives. When the ready carriage stopped near the estate, the young man sincerely thanked the family for their help. It's time to go. The head of the family vehemently denied it. After all, it was thanks to him that their family was saved from destruction. As a farewell, he smiled warmly at Clarissa and confessed that he had an incredibly fun time with her. Clarissa's father was noticeably nervous, but he sincerely thanked the guest for everything. The shoes softly turned on the cobblestones. Young Clarissa quietly addressed her parents. With tears in her eyes, she smiled happily and firmly stated that she would go with him. The boy stared in shock, not believing his own ears. While the girl was hugging her tearful relatives for the last time, the tall companion calmly summarized her choice. Clarisse tightened her grip on the magic staff and wiped away a tear. The boy couldn't take it anymore and smiled warmly, touched. Mastering his emotions, he decisively commanded to set off. The last tear slowly rolled down her cheek. The carriage surged forward amid the desperate cries of the parents to protect their daughter. The boy said goodbye loudly, leaving his hometown behind. Their joint journey was surprisingly smooth and carefree, until they reached this large building in the new city. Clarisse blushed deeply, shyly admitting that traveling with him was pure pleasure. The tranquility was interrupted by a scream. A panicking wealthy man burst into the hall with an urgent quest. He shouted that his slave had escaped straight to the monster forest and she needed to be returned immediately. The man flinched and wiped the cold sweat. Someone from the guild lazily wondered what was so special about this runaway. In despair, the wealthy man raised the reward to 100 gold coins, begging anyone to take up the search. He fired his main argument: the girl is an elf. The scarred mercenary thoughtfully tilted the mug, mentally assessing the substantial amount. The boy calmly nodded to Clarissa, indicating that it was time for them to leave. However, the Forest of Monsters was a real meat grinder, where even elite B-rank squads perished. Therefore, the mercenary firmly refused the client, choosing his own life over a bag of gold. A carriage thundered loudly outside the window. The despairing rich man lowered his gaze and resignedly told everyone to simply forget about the slave girl. Never. And you, Clarisse? The boy said firmly, already having made the decision to follow the elf. The girl quietly admitted that she had never seen them either. The carriage raced swiftly past the trees while the companion asked Mars about the elves. The boy calmly asked if they were currently passing through the same forest. The answer hung heavily in the air. Suddenly, Mars tensed sharply. He checked a map and grimly realized the bitter truth. In his mind, the thought beat, why did the Count send them this way? If there was a monster's lair nearby, the boy's pupil instantly dilated in shock. The girl's panic scream made him flinch. A child suddenly ran onto the road. The tearful elf girl was fleeing with her last strength, and behind her, a giant black snake was already slithering out of the thicket. Mars clenched the handles until they cracked. The elf girl was running towards them, and a heavy carriage was racing straight at her at full speed. The young man drew his sword and shouted for Clarissa to protect the little one, taking the snake upon himself. He rushed to confront the giant black predator while the girl ran away. A gigantic monster blocked the path of the stopped carriage, ominously looming over the child. The black giant snake opened its mouth, revealing a terrifying second jaw. The boy jumped back, blocking the random strike with his sword. He maneuvered swiftly around the giant and sliced the scales while the rescued girl ran away. Suddenly, the fangs clicked just millimeters from his face. The young man miraculously dodged and flew back. Behind him, the rock instantly belched black smoke. The snake spat poison. In response, he launched a powerful wind blade. Not a scratch. The attack simply dissipated against the tough shell. The system window confirmed the worst. The characteristics of the hellish snake surpassed those of the Goblin King. Basic magic would not suffice here. He focused and activated the Eye of the Sky. The tension suddenly dropped as the boy noticed a familiar archer in the bushes. Clarice. The arrow whistled and struck the snake right in the head. The boy tightened his grip on the sword. The monster opened its mouth in a fierce roar, and the girl cheerfully nodded. She understood her maneuver. The girl warned about the poison and shouted to Mars to buy her some time. Without turning around, he stood in the glow of a magical aura and calmly asked to wait a moment longer. The serpent spat a stream of poison, forcing the archer to flee. The boy focused. A whirlwind swirled in his right palm and fire burst forth in his left. He continued to draw energy. Suddenly, the monster left the girl and abruptly dashed towards Mars. She screamed wildly. A giant maw opened right above his head, but Mars stood still, waiting until the last moment. The deadly throw slipped past his protective aura. The barrier exploded, forcefully throwing the creature back several meters. Gathering the elements together, the boy charged into the attack. A swift lunge forward. The air was torn in half. With a devastating firestorm, he unleashed a searing whirlwind right onto the serpent's head. The boy was breathing heavily, frozen in a defensive stance, while the blonde girl behind him exclaimed excitedly. She smiled joyfully. It was a desperate step, but the magic worked perfectly. The boy looked at her with gratitude. The barrier had saved his life, leaving only a smoky trace around the sword from the enemy attack. Nearby, among the trees, a white carriage was hiding. The boy asked where the elf was now, and the blonde calmly replied that she had hidden her there. The elf girl huddled in the carriage, fearfully asking if they would return her to the merchant. They peered inside, cautiously asking the rescued if she was okay. Both looked at her with concern. The boy stepped forward and firmly stated that they were not going to give her to anyone. But the elf girl, in a fit of hysteria, curled up into a ball, crying that she didn't want to go back there. The blonde gently smiled and assured that it was indeed so, and a tear fell from the eyes of the frightened girl. She timidly asked again, still afraid to believe in her salvation, and then she suddenly dashed forward. The elf girl, with a loud cry, rushed into the embrace of the blonde girl, while the boy nearby watched in confusion. The girl shrank back, fearfully hiding her face when she heard her name. Misha. The blonde smiled warmly and gently asked what her name was. Through tears, the girl recounted that the man had kidnapped her, promising to take her to her mother. She carefully sat the little one on her lap, and she barely whispered her agreement to share what she had experienced. The decision was made instantly. Misha pressed tightly against the rescuer and plaintively whispered that she wanted to go to her mom. The boy confidently promised that they would find her together, and the child gratefully clenched her trembling fists. With tears streaming down her face, she fervently thanked her rescuers. The carriage moved through the forest. The heroes finally introduced themselves as Mars and Clarice, united in the search for Misha's mother. The beaten and dirty elf was told outright, first, she needs to be clean. The young man looked around the clearing near the carriage with satisfaction and got to work. He used earth magic, instantly raising a tall stone basin from the ground. In the next moment, a powerful jet of flame struck inside, and following that, a waterfall of clear water crashed down with a roar. The boy with a smile presented the ready hot bath, leaving the elf speechless. The blonde quickly took off her clothes and joyfully stretched before bathing. The little elf awkwardly took off her dirty jumpsuit, remaining barefoot. Already in the water, the blonde gently began to wash her hair. Both blissfully exhaled, finally relaxing. From behind the wall, a calm voice of a boy was heard. He assured that the elf girl could now speak freely. He stood steadfastly on guard when suddenly a shocked exclamation came from inside. It turned out he was the same age as her. The girls exchanged surprised glances. It turns out they are the same age as him. The water barely rippled. In the hot spring, the little elf was left speechless, staring at the voluptuous figure of the blonde. The blonde, by the way, asked what kind of person her mother was. And yet, the young man said thoughtfully. The girl proudly blossomed, boasting about her mother. A strong and beautiful V-rank adventurer. Mala exclaimed excitedly that her mom's breasts are just as big. The blonde was only embarrassed by such a comparison. Later, the boy patiently waited for them by the carriage in the middle of the forest. From behind the trees, the crew's open doors appeared. The companions finally set out ready for the road, and he sincerely thanked them. The order to march into the darkness rang out, and the heavy wheels broke free from their place. The elf girl spun around contentedly in her new, albeit slightly oversized, outfit, while the carriage raced them forward. Massive stone walls of a fortified city emerged among the trees. The girl was joyfully bouncing with happiness, and the wind quietly howled over the high-tiled roofs. The company looked around the colorful street, and someone among the adults reasonably remarked that there was nothing for the children to do here. Meanwhile, in the local tavern, the muscular mercenary reminded her partner of Count Beetle's order to avoid this town by all means. Our heroes had just stopped near the walls, squeezed between a safe path and a forest of monsters. In the alley, a terrifying one-eyed vagabond grinned menacingly. He was clutching a luxurious sword and anticipating the perfect con. The merchant stopped the boy and sweetly offered to take this masterpiece for just 10 gold coins. The boy calmly brushed off his empty pockets, ignoring the cries about the lost opportunity. The gloomy wall of the alley loomed over them. The dealer gripped the handle tighter and hissed ominously that one does not run away from such luck. But the young man simply apologized carelessly and quickly ran away, leaving the swindler with nothing. The quest guild had nothing for him, so he had to look for at least a room for the night. The girl at the counter sent him to the inn across the road, while behind the boy, two bald mercenaries silently warmed their ears. A bright full moon rose over the night city. The large predators grinned at each other. This small adventurer seemed to them like too easy a prey. A sudden shout made him stop. The young man walked calmly down the dark alley, fully aware that he had been followed for a long time. 3 bandits blocked the road and immediately accused him of fraud. The one-eyed thug roared furiously, outraged by his indifference. The boy politely declined their offer, but the attackers were not going to let such prey go. The fox giant suddenly lunged forward, trying to catch the little one with his bare hands. A lightning-fast leap, and the young man spun in the air, easily dodging the enemy's blade. He grabbed the weapon while the robbers were already dividing the money, promising to sell him dearly at auction. This statement confused the young man. The thieves were menacingly grinning, clutching their knives in anticipation of a big haul. The boy clenched the hilt of the sword, wishing for only one thing: to return to Clarice as quickly as possible. And here the bald man with a disgusting smile advised not to resist, so that the 2 girls caught nearby wouldn't feel so lonely. The young man felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He realized with horror that Clarissa and Misha were in their hands. The young man humbly lowered his weapon and asked to be taken to the girls. The heavy sword with a clang struck the stone. The battle was over. The fox-like thug patted the little one on the shoulder and immediately pulled a bag over his head. The light went out. The prisoner was brought to the luxurious estate. 2 kidnappers pushed the boy forward, boasting to their boss about the fresh catch. The leader contentedly propped his cheek. This lot will be the star of the night auction. The prisoner was taken deep into the building through bizarre corridors. At the table in the office, the leader ordered to take the boy to the room. With the order to keep his hands to himself, he was shoved into a room with 2 girls. The door slammed shut. The frightened boy's face changed instantly. He smirked slyly and gestured for them to be quiet. He quietly asked if they were all right. The captives nearly cried with joy upon recognizing Mars. He calmly surveyed their spacious prison. Live goods were treated well here, so his infiltration plan was going smoothly. In the locked room, 3 prisoners were finally left alone. The blonde smiled apologetically, sorry that they had fallen into captivity. The young man silently watched them. The little elf clung to her friend in tears, confessing that she was very scared. The boy calmly replied that he had surrendered to the enemies on purpose, to get them out of there. He sat down on the bed with the girls and assured them that everything would be fine. Hearing the firm promise of salvation, the elf maiden raised her hopeful eyes to him. It was just a little longer to endure. The young man warmly added that after the escape, they would find her mother together. The girl blushed and nodded happily. Suddenly, the door burst open with a bang. 2 guards appeared in the doorway and rudely commanded us to leave. A stern order to move forward rolled through the moon. A trio of prisoners with their hands tied was led out to the night street under close guard. A young man with 2 companions was examining the hall filled with submissive captives. He suddenly smiled widely. However, he quickly became serious upon noticing the fear on his little friend's face. The boy glanced at the relaxed guard and mentally decided that they just needed the right opportunity. Their confiscated weapons were lying right nearby. Meanwhile, in the neighboring room, a man in a mask ceremoniously announced the start of the best auction in their history. He greeted the crowd and officially kicked off the trading. The wealthy guests chattered impatiently, waiting for the first goods. The host laughed loudly, fueling the audience's excitement. They pushed a crying fat man onto the stage, a former baron who was valued at only 1 gold for his ability to read and write. The guests erupted in profanity. demanding that this rubbish be removed immediately and a worthy lot be shown. The auctioneer was taken aback but quickly recovered and promised to show the highlight of the program as a gesture of apology. The heavy curtain slowly parted. The main attraction of the evening turned out to be our trio of heroes. The bidding was opened by a tearfully frightened little elf with a starting price of 150 gold. Following the 100 coins, a silver-haired girl with an absolutely vacant gaze was brought out. The third lot featured a disciplined boy with golden eyes, valued at only 50. The room and masks greedily erupted with bets. Suddenly, there was an offer to give 800 gold coins immediately for the whole trio. The host slyly smiled when the price instantly jumped to 1,000. "Well, let's get started," he proclaimed, and a forest of hands rose again in the hall. The elf girl's eyes widened. She gasped for air. The crowd below howled and reached out to her, transforming into a pack of faceless predators. The silver-haired girl immediately hugged a trembling little one to herself. The burly bearded man raised his ring-adorned hand and lewdly declared that he really enjoyed the fear of this child. The auctioneer burst into a shout, demanding to outbid the crazy offer of 10,000 gold. "Is there no one else?" echoed from the stage, and the silver-haired woman froze in horror. The masked auctioneer raised his hand with satisfaction, 10,000 gold for all three. Suddenly, someone sharply commanded to stop. The auctioneer ignored this and triumphantly declared the lot sold. A gang burst into the hall led by a man who harshly asserted his claim on the elf. The local security had already been taken down on the floor. The leader's face twisted with anger. He shouted that Kid had stolen his property. At his command, armed mercenaries charged forward. The auctioneer's assistant immediately sent his fighters to intercept. The leader of the attackers howled the name Haida. The assistant roared fiercely in response, and two squads of cutthroats rushed towards each other. The light-haired young man tensed up. This chaos was the perfect opportunity for escape. The fighters clashed in a wild surge, crossing their weapons with a clatter. A heavy axe with sparks struck into the enemy's sword. An incantation of an ice rocket echoed in the hall, and sharp magical ice shards flew towards the enemy's backs. The giant swung down his massive axe, but the light-haired fighter barely managed to block the blade with his short sword. The young man froze with wide eyes in shock at the sudden rumble. From the balcony, he saw a mass brawl. The luxurious hall instantly turned into chaos. Below, a merciless slaughter was boiling. The mustached leader burst into a fierce laugh. A wild, excited cry of a man in a half-mask echoed his voice. The young man squinted coldly in this bloody mess. No one paid attention to them anymore. Part of the mercenaries was already fleeing in panic, screaming in terror. Meanwhile, an armed bandit nearby pulled back the curtain, preparing to take the boy and the girls. Our chance. The shackles on the prisoner's wrists suddenly flared up and shattered. The young man instantly struck with an energy pulse, throwing the stunned enemy back, who could not comprehend how he had freed himself. The young man suddenly groaned from a sharp pain in his eyes, frightening his companion to death. A clear thought flashed through my mind. I need to take someone else's sword. At that moment, the blade of the weapon mysteriously split in the air. The masked auctioneer burst into hysterical screams upon noticing the escape. But the guy, already armed, just carelessly winked at the girls and commanded them to exit. From the stage, they shouted to stop them, but a bald mercenary cut off the path for the guards, blocking the ninja's attack. Zadorovany maniacally burst into laughter, rejoicing at the long-awaited fight. His opponent was barely standing on his feet in the meantime. One wide swing, and the body in black flew away. Mockingly bidding farewell, the fox darted ahead, leaving behind only a blurred trace. In an instant, he is already taking down the next giant with an axe in a lightning-fast attack. Having cleared the obstacles, the fighter calmly exhaled and stated that he was done. Someone's strong hand squeezed the handle of a simple sword until it cracked. Someone dismissively remarked that the big guy only looks strong but doesn't know how to fight. The wizard with the staff looked around in disappointment. No one was able to resist his sleep magic. The hall fell silent. All the guards were lying sprawled on the floor. The mustached client, in a panic, erupted into a scream over the bodies of his guards, cursing their worthlessness. The masked warrior merely glanced coldly in response. Despair forced the wealthy man to thrust a bag of gold at the giant in the white cloak, begging for salvation. A massive hand confidently seized the heavy plate. Having received permission to permanently cripple the attackers, the mercenary, with a satisfied smile, slung the gigantic mace over his shoulder. The scarred giant ominously tightened his grip on the handles and warned that he would not touch the fugitives. He gave exactly 5 seconds for reflection. His gaze filled with fury. To those who would remain, he advised to start praying. The old bandit with an eye patch was instantly covered in cold sweat from this deadly aura. The two bald accomplices of his just smugly bared their teeth, exposing their blades. At the sharp command of their boss, they synchronously took up a combat stance, ready to launch an attack. The wizard tightly gripped the whimsical staff, preparing a spell. In front, a one-eyed swordsman stood, shielding him with his body. Two bald fighters of the vanguard rushed forward to block the scarred giant. He didn't even move, instantly figuring out their trick. One swing, and his giant sword shattered the one-eyed man's defense, causing the vanguard to look around in shock. The scarred one lazily stretched out, saying that it might have worked on the monster. He had already finished speaking when a trophy bag fell into his palm. The one-eyed creature howled in terror, while the bald ones froze in place. The devastating blow knocked the mage down, knocking the staff out of his hands. A blade sweep. The enemy was already behind them, weapon slung over his shoulder. "Hey, where are you looking?" One of the bald men suddenly spun around to strike. The second one, dripping with cold sweat, shouted to his partner to attack while he covered. The scarred one did not move from his spot, only from beneath his black hair. A fierce, bloodshot eye glared out. Two mercenaries turned sharply. One tried to block the attack, but the powerful blow simply knocked him off his feet. The giant warrior hurled both of them into the air with a single swing of his massive club. The old man in the hood trembled with fear. The monster blocked his exit. Civi realized in panic that he had destroyed the entire group in a single moment and was drenched in sweat. The giant roared wildly, forcing the old man to scream in response. The shadow covered the victim, and the warrior raised his weapon high. The blow shattered the floor into pieces. A wave of destructive force lifted debris of stone into the air. The young man in the black lace mask was stunned in shock. The mustached spectator, on the other hand, grinned ominously. The giant breathed heavily and his face was twisted with blind rage. The other attendees froze, not daring to even move. The giant stood in the middle of the shattered floor and indifferently announced that the quest was over while the others screamed and scattered. A heavy club struck the stone floor with a crack, scattering splinters. The one-eyed old man burst into a hoarse, self-satisfied laugh. The giant in the cloak turned to the stage, where only a small boy remained standing, shielding a girl with his body. The scarred giant squinted menacingly. It was becoming interesting. The boy froze nervously upon hearing the contemptuous question. Does kid really hire even such children for security? A dull thud of a weapon hitting the ground. Despite the fear, the boy gripped the wooden sword tighter and resolutely shielded the girl. Suddenly, the giant sprang from his place and leaped onto the podium in one jump. Scarred fingers gripped the handle tightly. In the darkness, wild eyes flashed. Powerful jerk. A mountain of muscles loomed right behind the boy with a cold question. Does he want to end up like everyone else? The boy desperately pointed a toy sword at him, although the attacker soothingly growled that it was a misunderstanding, and he wouldn't harm the little one if he just stepped back. The boy stubbornly squinted, not stepping back an inch, and then the giant erupted, his face twisted with rage, and he bellowed furiously for him to get out of the way. The young man gritted his teeth, sweating under the heavy gaze. "Get lost," roared the fierce growl of the enemy. The boy stood frozen in shock. A desperate thought about illusion flashed through my mind. His blade pierced through the body of the scarred giant, but met no resistance. The big guy didn't even flinch. He simply waved the young man away with a careless motion of his hand. The giant suddenly froze in the middle of his strike. A phantom silhouette of a boy unexpectedly flashed before his eyes. The pupils of both instantly dilated in shock. "I see the future?" The big guy couldn't believe his eyes. Its massive blade crashed into the floor just millimeters from the target. He gloomily hovered over the little one and asked who he was. The eye of the giant suspiciously squinted, as it could not be just a coincidence. This brat has already dodged his deadly attacks twice. The young man clenched his sword until the knuckles turned white and briefly refused. He called his heavenly eye and asked if the giant would let them go if he told everything. Sweat was rolling down his pale face, and his dilated eyes revealed wild fear. The mercenary just grinned. The boy intrigued him, and he wouldn't let him escape. But the boy, peering into the enemy's status, went pale. He had never seen such high stats before. Instead of an answer, the giant lunged forward so swiftly that the boy barely had time to comprehend his speed. The black blade sliced through the air with a whistle, but the young man miraculously managed to dive under the strike. The attacker shouted that there was no way to dodge, not giving a second to rest. The giant with scars slowly turned around, blinking with eerie white eyes. The boy barely blocked the strike of his massive staff with his sword. The recoil was so strong that it knocked the young man back several steps. The wild cutting began at a crazy speed. The young man fearlessly rushed forward. Doravani felt a genuine shock upon seeing such a luxurious combat talent. He put all his strength into a wide swing, but the boy swiftly slipped under the weapon. Both recoiled, and the giant gloomily inquired why such a capable warrior was assisting the slave trader. "Why are you using your strength like that?" he shouted, while the young man frantically considered escape options. The boy exploded with anger and shouted that he was looking for the scoundrel who had kidnapped the innocent elf, Misha. The giant's eyes widened sharply at what he heard. The young man instantly caught his bewilderment. In his mind, a puzzle formed of a frightened man in a mask who was panic-stricken and recoiling from the girls. Without wasting a second, the boy thrust his hand forward and knocked down the bewildered enemy with a powerful water blade. The man helplessly flew back from the powerful blow. The blonde girl clung to her partner in fear under the hail of black debris. The boy tensed up and sharply raised his palm. Enough. The muscular giant stood still. The elf in the cloak quietly remembered her true client. Hearing that the guy was not his enemy, the giant shockingly realized his mistake. Against the backdrop of the night estate, the masked mercenary revealed the cards. She was hired by Misha's mother, Sasha. Her icy gaze pierced through. "What's your name?" The voice echoed loudly through the empty hall. The giant Mars lowered his enormous sword and acknowledged the boy's strength, naming himself. Suddenly, a magical bowstring shone. An unknown archer politely asked to be given the elven child. The mustached man was covered in cold sweat, finally realizing that his enemies were now united. He jerked sharply. The air was cut by a whistle. 2 arrows struck hard under the knees of the masked man, forcing him to collapse to the floor. Busan fell helplessly face down in horror. The blonde screamed wildly in pain. The merchant cried out loudly in absolute hysteria. 2 more arrows ruthlessly pierced the body of the masked man. At the end of the hall, on the balcony, a dark silhouette of a shooter stood motionless. Dead silence. The boy was stunned by this lightning-fast execution. A huge giant loomed over the small boy, gripping a 2-handed sword. Suddenly, his face contorted with animal terror. He felt her presence. The heavy blade fell to the floor with a clatter from trembling hands. From the shadows emerged an elf in a mask, quietly uttering Sasha's name. She quickly landed and determined that this man was not an enemy. One look from her paralyzed me. With an incredible leap, the woman soared over the roof, shouting to the boy to use the recommendation to the school of the strongest. Mars unfolded the paper. He was ordered to go to the National School of Lister. The elf silently descended behind the tall doors. Zoravani nervously shouted after him, checking if the little one understood everything. She barely threw out a "thank you." A girl rushed her from the corridor, joyfully calling out for her mom. In an instant, the stern warrior broke down, and tears burst from her eyes. But just a second later, she pushed aside her emotions and strode forward fiercely. The elf in a black mask strode forward menacingly. Suddenly, a child's cry rang out. A little girl with tears was running towards, calling for her mom. The woman froze and began to cry, unbelievingly exhaling her daughter's name. "Misha." They broke free from their place and tightly merged in an embrace. Through tears, the mother gently smiled, assuring that everything was fine now. A mother's palm rested on her daughter's head and a quiet sadness resonated in her voice. She picked up the little one in her arms, swearing never to let her go again. The elf pressed the child to her chest in pain, bitterly blaming herself for her suffering. A blonde young man and a girl quietly watched them from the passage. A brief dark pause. They just stood silently next to each other. Suddenly, the girl playfully sneaked up from behind and grabbed the boy by the shoulders. He blinked in confusion, and he smiled warmly. The girl praised her partner for his work, and he sighed with relief and broke into a grateful smile. They recounted all the recent events while standing right over the enemy tied to the floor. The elf girl with a small child in her arms nodded at the rescuers and confirmed that they were the ones who came to her aid. The conversation was interrupted by a question about food. A massive tray covered with a lid was placed on the table in front of the guests. As a token of gratitude, the entire company was invited to the spacious mansion where Sasha was currently living. The lid flew off, revealing a gigantic rosy turkey, and a call to feast to the fullest rang out. The girl joyfully started working with a fork under the warm gaze of the elf. Sasha chewed the meat with her eyes closed in pleasure. The boy also didn't waste any time and greedily stuffed his cheeks. The bandits lay on the ground in puddles of their own blood. Sasha was not lying. Hanal had truly turned into a breeding ground for crime. The sharp roofs of the local houses silently towered over the streets. The elf worriedly reminded Mars of Count Bill's words, "This city is too dangerous for children." Already by the carriage, she awkwardly confessed that she had spent almost all her savings on the search for little Misha. The woman handed the boy a small pouch of coins as a sign of gratitude. Mars smiled sincerely and replied that this was quite enough. He warmly added that they are very happy to meet the girl. The elf emotionally leaned forward, sincerely thanking for the rescue of the little one. She gently stroked Misha's head and she cheerfully said goodbye to her rescuers, Clarissa and Mars. They waved back with warm smiles, promising to miss their new friend. The woman with the child stood for a long time on the cobblestone square, shouting words of gratitude after the crew. The carriage rolled away, leaving behind the massive fortress walls of the criminal city. The horses leisurely pulled the carriage along the dirt road towards the mountains. In the distance, the cozy roofs of the new settlement were already visible. Clarisse timidly tugged at his sleeve. At the hotel reception, the young man casually requested 2 separate rooms. The girl suddenly interrupted. The beds will still be different anyway. He froze. Feeling shy, she quietly suggested spending the night in the same room. And here they were already sitting on opposite sides of the room in a deafening, uncomfortable silence. Clarisse shyly hid her eyes. The boy was also barely holding himself together, hiding his anxiety behind a strained smile. Unable to withstand the tension, the girl nervously laughed and sent him to the bathroom first. He gladly seized the opportunity to refuse. Let Clarisse go first. She jokingly remarked that self-proclaimed gentlemen always raise suspicion. The boy just laughed, firmly insisting on his own. Both burst into loud laughter, shedding their incredible awkwardness. Already submerged up to her nose in hot water, Clarisse reassured herself. It was much safer to sleep together so that she wouldn't be kidnapped again. The girl blushed deeply. Although the beds were separate, the thought of spending the night with Mars in the same room made her heart race. The very thought of it made her cheeks burn. Trying to calm her emotions, she submerged herself in the water up to her nose. But a timid thought flashed by. Mars was carelessly lying on the bed at that time, twirling a small artifact between his fingers. Hiding her gaze in the water, the girl finally decided to get closer to him. Suddenly, the boy sat up sharply. The stone flashed brightly, warning that the family was somewhere very close. The glow in the hand intensified, throwing through the door that his family was nearby and he would be gone for a short while. The boy disappeared, and the bewildered Clarisse just called after him to wait. Mars? A voice rang out. The boy rushed to the door, burning with impatience to see his relatives. He ran out onto the cobblestones of the night city with a single thought. They had come for him. On the square stood the father and brothers with the same shining crystals in their hands. They froze, not expecting to see Mars so soon. The gaze froze in shock. The light-haired boy joyfully jumped up and ran towards them. The man with a warm smile gathered both children into a strong embrace while the dark-haired boy was choking on tears of relief. Zick Bryant and his younger son Ike warmly welcomed Clarisse, whom the father already knew from the letter. The girl with the warm smile introduced herself. Everyone sat down at the table, and Zick suggested chatting over food. The maid brought a huge tray of juicy meat skewers. Father tilted the mug to the bottom with pleasure. Ike chewed contentedly, his cheeks stuffed full. Clarisse and Mars also eagerly dug into the hot dinner. At the table, they animatedly recounted their adventures. The battle with the hellish serpent in the demon forest, the meeting with Misha and Sasha, and the trip to the auction. Impressed, Zeke raised his thumb, sincerely proud of Mars's feats. After listening to the story to the end, the father calmly set down the mug. He turned over his shoulder, checking if everyone had taken their things. A covered cart ready for departure was already waiting on the cobbled street. The whip cracked, and Zick commanded to head home. The white horse reared up and bolted from the spot. The company gladly supported the idea. Ahead, a massive stone fortress was already visible. Their covered cart slowly approached the open gate past the motionless guards with halberds. And somewhere far away, black clouds and lightning tore the sky above the ominous castle. The wheels rolled steadily over the cobblestones. They crossed the bridge. Inside, everyone was enjoying the ride. Friends were laughing and giving thumbs up, while the coachman looked back at them with satisfaction. The sudden goblin attack was cut short instantly. The monster caught 2 accurate shots right in the eyes, not even managing to get close. The horse neighed and reared up. The long road had exhausted him to the limit. Later, they had to make a brief stop so the girl could restore the strength of the exhausted horse with healing magic. The path led further through the quiet plains. Clouds slowly floated over the tall grass. The sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the cart into a lonely dark silhouette. Eventually, the travelers reached the high wall and safely entered the city. The cart approached the high city walls. He quickly drove through the cobbled streets past the residential neighborhoods. The squeak of the wheels, and they stopped. The woman on the porch froze. She pressed her palms to her lips, exhaling the name Mars through tears. The boy finally brought his friends to his own home. The mother couldn't hold back and, with a scream, rushed to meet her son. The face of Mars shone, and Clarisse smiled warmly beside him. Maria tightly hugged the boy, while he quietly apologized for all her worries. The little sister joyfully grabbed her brother's hand with a run. The woman hugged him even tighter, gently welcoming him home. Clarisse silently watched as Mars genuinely marveled at how much the little one had grown. The girl pressed tightly against her brother, rejoicing in his return. Calming down a bit, the mother introduced herself as Maria Bryant. She cheerfully clapped her hands and immediately addressed Clarisse. The girl playfully lifted the edge of her skirt, lightly smiling as she praised their manners. Following her, the light-haired stranger awkwardly curtsied and introduced herself as Clarissa Lambard. The whole group finally gathered together in the room. It got dark outside, and the lights turned on in their spacious house. The friends joyfully raised their mugs, celebrating Mars's return and welcoming the newcomer Clarice. They simply smiled warmly in response, sincerely thanking for such a hospitable reception. At the table, the man asked Maria to help Clarissa settle into the new place. Clarice nodded with a warm smile. Maria gently assured that she would quickly get used to everything. Suddenly, little Lena peeked out from behind the table and exclaimed with shining eyes that she would help too. Clarice warmly replied that she was happy to meet her new sister. Since then, they became inseparable. Lina instantly bonded with the girl. Meanwhile, another boy was energetically helping his father with work outside, but his brother Ike sat gloomily in the room, completely absorbed in exhausting studying. A month has passed. The shadows of the trees swayed gently in the wind. The men gathered the whole team by the cart and announced the task from Count Carmela. They were assigned to clear the Almeria labyrinth of monsters. Everyone confidently and harmoniously took a step towards the new mission. Upon arriving at the location, they joined a long line at the registration desk among other adventurers. Ahead of them lay the infamous labyrinth of Almeria. The tall man looked down at the little one and shamelessly accused him of stealing equipment. "Hey!" he called sharply to the young man from behind. The man confidently clenched his fist and demanded that he prove his strength in battle. The boy calmly stated that his team honestly obtained these items from the chests in the labyrinth. They met in the middle of the square, and the giant threatened to take the armor for himself if the little one turned out to be too weak. In the next moment, the giant's face twisted from the sudden blow. The young man's eyes gleamed coldly. With a powerful upward swing of the sword, he knocked out his opponent's jaw. The air was pierced by a sharp whistle. The movement was faster than the human eye. The big guy fell heavily onto the pavement, unconscious, and the shocked crowd erupted into screams. A local noble approached the young man and greeted him as the son of Count Bryant. The nobleman examined the letter from his father that had been handed to him while the onlookers around whispered in astonishment about the child's noble lineage. The young man politely greeted and confirmed that he had arrived here by the Count's order to clear the labyrinth. A calm day gently descended upon the rooftops of the city. Silence reigned all around. A local resident sincerely thanked the trio of young men for their help with the cleanup. However, their path lay further to the massive stone gates of the dungeon. From the black maw, a white silhouette suddenly emerged. In an instant, a whole flock rose into the air. "Silver D-rank birds, don't relax," shouted the boy with the spear, and the squad instantly prepared for battle. The girl cold-bloodedly shot an arrow straight at the beast. The white-haired young man struck the bird with a sharp magical blow. The list-bearer put all his strength into a sweeping swing and knocked the enemy down in midair. The hall was filled with the whistling of blades and flashes of lightning attacks. When it was all over, the fighters exhaled heavily, staring blankly ahead. On the floor lay a gigantic pile of magical stones. It was physically impossible to stuff that many into pockets. Astonished at this treasure, they decided to return home and call for help from their father. They faced an obvious problem: there were too many magical stones to collect them all. Suddenly, the young man joyfully intertwined his fingers in black gloves and, with a smile, proposed a simple solution: to go and buy a slave. All three of his companions stood frozen in place, speechless. The heroes stopped in front of the massive market building, looking for a nimble and strong porter. The friendly clerk in glasses immediately offered them to buy a beast-man slave. Having received permission, he led the group inside. Before them stretched a gigantic multi-tiered atrium, completely covered with chambers. The team rushed down the long corridor. They were already being closely monitored from the upper tiers. The beastmen looked down on humans, categorically refusing to acknowledge them as their masters. In their predatory eyes, unmasked rage and caution boiled. The conductor could only laugh nervously, feeling this heavy tension. Suddenly, the light-haired boy abruptly froze in front of a pair of daft doors. A heavy blow struck from within, and behind the wall, relaxedly stroking a giant lioness, sat a muscular warrior. It was Duke Saranz, one of the 12 rulers of the former alliance and a true leader of the beastmen. Overthrown during the coup and sold for a fortune, he remained unyielding. The Duke would swear allegiance only to those who proved their superiority in strength. The boy was stunned. A muscular man was sitting relaxed on the carpet, calmly stroking a white lion among the children's toys. The pupil narrowed sharply. A hexagram flared in the eye. The heavenly eye turned on. A sudden burst of white noise. At that moment, a terrifying shadow loomed over him with a raised fist. Black energy crackled on the joints. A powerful shockwave knocked the boy off his feet in front of his shocked friends. While the crowd reached out to him in horror, the attacker didn't even flinch. The young man's body was thrown across the entire hall. In flight, he gritted his teeth and sharply cut off clairvoyance. Barely had he touched the floor when the enemy was already rushing through the debris of the wall. Realizing that he couldn't evade, the boy desperately summoned a barrier at the last second. The crazy fist crashed into the magical shield just a millimeter from his face. The man squinted discontentedly. Zorvan rushed into the attack so sharply that the guy immediately understood there was no chance to dodge. Claresi fearfully stretched out her hands. The enemy's fist shattered the magical barrier like thin glass. The boy desperately rushed forward to save the girl. He stood frozen before the enormous opponent, knowing that this blow could be his last. The space cracked. The steel fist crashed into the boy's block with a deafening roar, carving out lightning. Crazy pressure. The boy's eyes widened in pain, but he stubbornly stayed on his feet. The shockwave shattered the air around. The attackers squinted in surprise while the crowd of witnesses simply froze. The young man nervously shrank back in front of the tall, semi-naked fighter in the middle of the ruined hall. "This is lightning magic?" he exclaimed in astonishment. Electric discharges crackled threateningly across the muscular arm of the giant. He calmly asked why the guy suddenly jumped at him. Mars was gulping air, dripping with cold sweat. The fighter understood everything at once. He felt a foreign attempt to scan his skills. The boy's eyes widened in horror when the man added that he had deliberately decided to scare him. The boy bowed apologetically and asked for forgiveness. Zaravan sharply clenched his fist. He turned away and Mars cautiously dared to ask him his name. The young man politely bowed and introduced himself as Mars Bryant. The man waved dismissively when suddenly someone from the audience timidly asked for permission to check his status once more. The fighter glanced over his shoulder and replied briefly, "Burns Leo." A system window flared up in front of Mars and he froze. Leo's physical strength and endurance indicators reached abnormal figures. The muscular blonde stood completely motionless. A sudden movement sliced through the space. Before my eyes, a characteristics window appeared. Burns Leo, colossal physical strength and only one pitiful unit of luck. The light suddenly dimmed. His palm clenched into a fist with a dull crack. The air suddenly became heavy. Flash and collar of a foreign uniform. From the invisible pressure, the surface was covered with a dense web of cracks. The stone continued to threaten to crumble. The young man took a deep breath and threw himself straight at the broad back of the giant who was walking past the white lion cub towards the breach in the wall. "They are looking for a slave." Leo didn't even slow down and dryly interrupted, "Are you done?" Zetarovan threw it away, saying that he wouldn't go anywhere without it. A white lion cub was waiting for him by the breach. The boy blinked in confusion and stumbled over a short butt. Zarvan cast a predatory glance over his shoulder at him, flashed his fangs, and coldly declared that he would never submit to someone weaker than himself. The young man stood in the middle of the hall under the loud applause of the crowd from the balconies. He clearly caught the attention of someone else. He smiled joyfully when the shouts of beastmen echoed around him, who were already asking to serve him. The man in glasses nervously wiped his sweat, silently acknowledging the coolness of the kid. The boy calmly asked the trio of beast people if he could now examine them all. Time has passed. The company found itself near a huge estate, where the aristocrat quickly convinced himself that all was well. 5 new subordinates lined up in the stone courtyard. The first to introduce themselves were 3 wolf brothers, the muscular eldest Guy, the middle one Mac, and the chubby youngest Oru. Following her, the blonde Misa greeted softly. The dark-haired Ray lively called out her name. The aristocrat commanded to set off. He proudly announced that he had rented the entire spacious wooden house for them. They entered the large dining room, where the host smiled slyly and suggested starting. The table was immediately covered with mountains of delicious food, and the whole company joyfully pounced on the feast. The girl with pigtails timidly asked if the host would mind having dinner together with them at the same table. Outside the wooden house, a deep night had already fallen. The blonde aristocrat allowed it, but the girl suddenly sternly reprimanded the 3 beast-like slaves for their lack of manners. The big guys exchanged confused glances and humbly lowered their heads. The boy calmly nodded and added that starting tomorrow, all decisions would be made by Ike. When everyone finally sat down at the table, the blonde abruptly got down to business. It was time to discuss the duties of the new slaves. His main requirement was simple, not to harm the hosts until the move to Irgudzia, which was planned for 3 years later. The 2 other girls, Ray and Missy, were immediately assigned household chores. After the move, the trio of beastmen expected regular raids in the dungeons. After dinner, they quickly divided the rooms on the 3 floors of the spacious mansion. The blonde ordered everyone to go to bed as the preparations were starting early in the morning. The next day, the beastmen proudly showed Ake their newly obtained E-rank adventurer licenses and asked about the next steps. The whole company gathered in the lively square right in front of the entrance to the local guild. The young man gripped his staff more firmly and smiled slyly. He would decide on the next plan only after he personally assessed their combat skills. The young adventurers shuffled around the yard, waiting for instructions. The trio of sturdy beastmen nearby was also waiting for their task. They were brought into a spacious hall opposite 3 stone lizards and given a brief order to deal with them first. The deft brick wall behind left no room for maneuvering. Monsters aggressively lurked, displaying strong armor and a whole 100 health points. But the Jet brothers only found it amusing. Zorvani had a colossal advantage in attack statistics. The characteristics of Gaia and Mars also left the reptiles no chance. With a wild roar, they simultaneously sprang from their positions and charged straight at the enemy. Barely noticeable self-assured smile, a predatory snarl of shark teeth, a cold, focused gaze. All 3 simultaneously charged into the monsters in the middle of the arena. A powerful kick from a turn struck directly into the stone face of the lizard, creating an explosive wave. He struck the lizard squarely in the jaw. The monster instantly responded with a sharp swipe of its tail to the face. The boy didn't even flinch. He just grinned predatorily. With a sudden leap, he brought his fist down on the creature's tail, pressing the flattened lizard to the ground with a foot. He glanced indifferently over his shoulder. A devastating kick sent the monster flying away. The body crashed into the stone wall with a thud. The lizard helplessly crawled down the wall onto the pavement. With a final convulsive jerk, the lizard struck him across the back. The heavy blow left deep scratches. The boy suddenly bent over, grabbed his wound, and mournfully whined about the pain in his back. And in a moment, he stood silently in torn pants with an absolutely impassive face. The trio could barely stand on their feet from exhaustion. But their leader confidently placed his hands on his hips and declared with a victorious smirk, "We have defeated everyone." The defeated trio of beastmen confidently sought praise, but the young man with the spear coldly cut in, "This is unacceptable." An awkward silence settled in. The leader angrily demanded to know the reason. The mercenaries stared at him in silent shock at such harsh criticism. The boy ignored the question and calmly ordered his companions to first tend to these unfortunate heroes. The tension eased and the giant friendly patted the leader on the back. The priestess girl extended her hand, gently healing their wounds with holy magic. The astonished giant remembered that bearers of such power mature too quickly and foolishly asked about her age. The answer took their breath away. The priestess smiled sweetly and confessed that she was only 8 years old. The girl blushed from the attention to her not-so-childish figure while the beast people panicked. The leader shouted about harassment and instantly received a harsh kick from his sister. The young man interrupted this chaos and stated that he would now detail all their mistakes. He sighed wearily. Now the ashamed mercenaries were tearfully begging for forgiveness while the embarrassed priestess awkwardly tried to calm them down. The young man intercepted the spear, ordered the group to watch, and charged straight at the armored monsters. A sudden movement with a free hand and a sharp command. A huge pillar of flame erupted from his palm, instantly engulfing the enemies. The spearhead scraped as it embedded into the hard skull of the beast. With one smooth pull, he pierced the first monster through and through. Turning to his companions, he asked if they had noticed the difference. A wide swing of the weapon forced the rest of the creatures to retreat. The young man raised his voice, "In this place, only the tactics of battle decide." Isekai'D awkwardly laughed and admitted that they do not possess magic at all. The boy explained, "They waste energy on overly heavy strikes and risk getting injuries that will make it impossible to continue." The group moved deeper into the labyrinth through the dark stone corridors. The werewolf cheerfully promised to fight in the team from now on, and the big guy happily nodded. Suddenly, a giant scarred bear emerged from the darkness with a fierce roar, blocking their path. The young man didn't flinch and calmly challenged the beasts. It was time to see if they could think. A powerful punch met the enemy attack head-on. The fighter charged and crashed into the huge bear, knocking it onto its back. The fierce grizzly roared and raised its massive clawed paw. At that moment, a young man with cat ears jumped behind him in a flash. While the giant partner blocked the predator in front, the boy in flight delivered a crushing kick to its head. "Well, how is it?" The leader grinned self-satisfied. A trio of fighters stood proudly in front of the carcass, while the rest of the team waited on the path behind. The winners shone with satisfaction. The young man with the staff gave them a thumbs up from afar. The group moved further through the dark corridors of the dungeon. They stopped by the passage. Only a flight of stairs to the second floor remained, and then they could go home. Ahead opened a gigantic hall with high stone columns. Suddenly, shock and genuine horror froze on the faces of the entire team. Everyone was silent. The boy froze at the threshold right in front of him. A swarm of giant ants was greedily tearing apart the carcass of a dead beast. "What is happening here?" he exclaimed inwardly, looking at the walls covered in insects. He could only watch in stunned silence at this bloody feast. New ants were quickly sliding down the stone columns. solid dark stream. The blond boy froze in front of the giant swarm of insects. The entire second floor turned out to be a solid anthill. There were too many creatures. His partner glanced at the carpet of black shells and decided to raise the alarm immediately. The guys burst into the office of Manager Ralph with an urgent report. The anxious voice echoed all the way to the street in front of the guild building. In the room sat Margrave Evan Sorum, who calmly greeted the young men. Ralph cut the formalities and ordered to move on to the news. Hearing about the insects, he jumped up from the table, and the Margrave fearfully recognized the killer ants in the monsters. These creatures should be sitting in the forest of death, and were known for their rampant reproduction that devoured everything in their path. He voiced the worst. If the horde grows, the labyrinth simply won't be able to sustain them. Ralph was covered in cold sweat. The boys huddled on the couch. The Margrave gloomily averted his gaze. The blond young man touched his chin, feverishly contemplating a plan of action. The man looked intently at the young men and asked what exit they saw. The blonde replied instantly. He proposed to recruit 3 groups of Sea Crank's mercenaries, Brown Shield, Blue Fangs, and Red Wings. Together with the best urban adventurers, he planned to recruit the enslaved beastmen as well. But the key detail was different. They critically needed the destructive power of the giant burns. The herd returned the older one's fighting spirit. They were ready to fight to the death again. Ralph quickly ordered to contact the window Bryant. The light in the windows of the dark mansion burned for a long time. Burns' power became the decisive argument that convinced Ralph to take the risk. The next day, the gathered crowd of mercenaries awaited instructions, and the boy gave the command to start. In the forefront stood armored bald giants, the Brown Shield. Nearby, variously skilled mages and swordsmen from the Blue Icicles lined up, and the self-assured fighters of the Red Wings closed ranks. The boy inquired about the decision of the Beast People. In front of him stood a long line of fighters. It turned out that everyone was involved in the case except for one. One of the fighters stumbled while approaching the only one who refused. The messenger admitted that he couldn't even get close to Burns. Hearing the client's name, the giant demanded a personal meeting with the leader. The young impan came alone, and Burns looked down in surprise, not expecting to see him there at all. The muscular giant gloomily loomed over the guest at the door. The boy tensed up.